Good morning, everyone. Welcome. It is a thrill to see so many people here in the room in person, and we're also thrilled that we have so many folks joining us online. We're so excited to be able to offer this Advanced Practice Provider Symposium today. My name is Jamie Myers, and I chair the Nursing Research Subcommittee under the auspices of the Oncology Research Professionals. And here's my clicker. Let's see if I can advance. Oops. Okay, so we have some thank yous. Big thank you to the Palliative and End of Life Care Committee, who has co-sponsored this event with us. We are very, very grateful for the time and dedication that have been provided by our Advanced Practice Provider Intergroup Working Group and Planning Committee for their dedication and making this the event that you're going to get to experience today. And a huge thank you to the Hope Foundation for Cancer Research, because they're the ones who have provided the funding to support this initiative to advanced practice providers' interaction and involvement with research-based trials. So, because we are a hybrid meeting, there's a few asks of the participants. For those of you who are joining us virtually, we ask that you do stay on mute during the duration of the program. And to save bandwidth, we're asking that you leave your camera off, and we're asking that you put your questions for us in the chat, and we'll be dealing with those during the question and answer session. And for those of you who are joining us in person, special ask, if you have a question, we're going to ask you to step to one of these two floor mics so the folks on Zoom will be able to benefit from your question as well. Here's the agenda that we'll be covering today. And just as an FYI, for those of you who plan ahead, between our opportunities for research basis panel and the protocol review, we have a 15-minute break planned, assuming we're not too far behind schedule by that point. So that'll be a good time for a bio break. And I have the distinct pleasure of being able to introduce our first speaker. And the task force has put together a stellar entree of speakers for you today. So I get to introduce Kate Castro. She is a nurse consultant for the Division of Cancer Control and Population Science, and she'll be reviewing for us the NCI-sponsored research within NCTN and NCORE, and she has some really exciting data to share this morning. So welcome to Kate.
Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to see everyone here, the number of attendees in the virtual side of the room as well as here in person. It's an absolute pleasure. I agree. I want to say thanks to the Planning Committee and the Hope Foundation for making this possible, and all the work across the various groups and research bases too. This is really exciting. So I want to begin by acknowledging some of my advanced practice nursing colleagues back at the NCI who really are instrumental in me being here this morning, excuse me, and that is Ms. Andrea Denikoff and Ms. Marge Good. Many of you in the meeting today probably know those two individuals, and Andrea and Marge have done a lot of the work with our teams at NCI to update our policies and guidelines, and you're going to hear about this morning. So I just want to acknowledge the instrumental participation they have had in this work along the way, and pleasure to be here this morning to present on behalf of our team. So NCI has numerous large clinical trial networks. One of them is the Experimental Therapeutic Clinical Trials Network, and that does the early phase treatment trials or the drug development trials. We also have the NCI National Clinical Trial Network, also known as the NCTN, and that's the group that does the late phase treatment trials. This is a very large network that many of you are familiar with. And in addition, we have a community network that's called the NCI Community Oncology Research Program, or NCORE. And the NCORE program conducts cancer prevention and control studies, symptom science and symptom management studies, cancer screening trials, and cancer care delivery research studies. So a very broad spectrum of research that we do. Today, my presentation is going to focus on the NCTN and NCORE and giving you a little bit of background about these structures and how they work. So starting with the NCTN, or National Clinical Trials Network, There are 5 groups within the NCTN, and you see those depicted on the screen here as the large dark red spheres. SWOG, Alliance, NRG, ECOG Akron, and the Children's Oncology Group make up these 5 groups. You can see on each of these groups there are smaller spheres because each of the groups has an operations center, a data and stats center, as well as tumor banks, and they have multiple lead academic performing centers, which are LAPs, as well as NCTN member sites. There in the center is the smaller red sphere, which are all the centralized functions, many of which are provided by the National Cancer Institute. So this is including the Clinical Trials Support Unit, or CTSU. That's the place where all of our information related to our trials is housed. It's kind of that central kitchen of where you get all your information. The central IRB is also part of our central functions, as well as the Imaging and Radiation Oncology Core, or IROC. So the NCI has these core functions that all of the groups feed into. I'd like to call your attention on the lower left to the blue sphere, which indicates the NCORE participation in the NCTN. We're going to talk a little bit more about NCORE in a moment, but as we talk throughout the morning here in the training session, consider that NCORE has access to all of the trials that are done within the NCTN. So all of these treatment trials in the NCTN are accessible to the NCORE network as well. And this is how it's done through this kind of adding into the network on the side there. Looking at the NCORE structure, we have 7 what we call research bases in NCORE. And you see the 7 bases listed here: SWOG, NRG, ECOG Akron, Alliance, and the Children's Oncology Group. So those are the same 5 that you saw, also have NCTN group grants. We have 2 additional research bases in NCORE. That would be the Wake Forest NCORE research base, as well as the University of Rochester Cancer Center research base. These 2 research bases do not do the treatment trials because you didn't see them on the NCTN schematic, but they do conduct all of the other trials such as symptom science, cancer control, cancer care delivery as such. In NCORE, the research bases design these studies. They are the lead houses for conducting all of the studies as well. NCORE then has 46 sites across the US. 32 of them are community sites and 14 are minority and underserved community sites. So these 46 sites then have multiple affiliates and sub-affiliates. It's almost like a spoke coming off of a main hub. And so within the 46 sites, we have over 1,000 practices across the United States, including in Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Guam. And we cover almost every state in the union. We have a few states, such as West Virginia as an example, that does not have an NCORE affiliate or sub-affiliate in it. I think Vermont is another one of our states, in New Hampshire. But again, we have a really, really wide spectrum of coverage across community sites across the United States. So taking both of those into consideration, this is just another depiction of how NCTN and NCORE relate to each other. Again, NCTN focused on the treatment trials and the advanced imaging studies, NCORE focusing on cancer prevention, cancer control, and as well as cancer care delivery. And then they interface and overlap, and throughout all of that are the NCI core functions that you see on the bottom that support everything. So considering these structures and our NCI sponsored trials, we wanted to really take a look this morning at the role of the advanced practice providers in our trials. And in 2020, a survey was conducted that looked at the role of oncology APPs in clinical trials work. 35% of the respondents to the survey were from academic centers and 62% from community settings. 70% of the respondents reported that their practice participated in NCI-sponsored clinical trials. Not a surprise, we know that the majority of you are participating in that. Interestingly enough, more than 50% of the respondents also said that they see, APPs see a patient who is participating on a clinical trial on a weekly basis, either for a symptom assessment, monitoring for toxicities, doing education, or some part of their role. They are seeing patients that are on trials. 70% said their practice participates in these trials, yet only about 37% said that, I actively go out and seek trials for my patients. So again, a lot of participation in the studies, but it's like, I'm not going out and seeking patients to come onto the studies probably as much as I would like to. And again, 90% felt that APP should play a role in the clinical research, and 73% wanted to be more involved. So the survey also helped us with what are these barriers then? We're seeing that people want to do this work, they feel it's important, you've got these patients, but yet you don't feel as engaged as you want to be. And some of the barriers that were noted were clinical trial related education, hence why we're here this morning. And I again want to commend this group for pulling this together, because this, I think, these educational opportunities and the opportunity to engage with others who are doing your role in your work is really, really important. And then on the NCI side, it was also noted that we had some barriers, such as our policy that required qualified physician investigators to co-sign APP's orders for study agents, and also our policies that limited APP's roles in NCI trials. So based on the information from this survey, we got busy at the NCI looking at what we could do to really make sure that we were moving things along. I think there might be a slide missing here. Whoops, sorry. So we did look at, the main thing was writing orders. So before September of 2021, it was a requirement that anytime an APP wrote an order, it had to be co-signed by a physician investigator. After September of 2021, the CTEP policy was revised so that APPs now may write orders, and it does not require a co-signature by a physician investigator. So this was a significant change. Also, the policy looked at who was qualified as an APP, and this was a lot of work that we did at NCI here. So we determined that nurse practitioners, physician's assistants, pharmacists, and advanced degree nurses such as clinical nurse specialists, DNPs, and such all could have roles within this work. And understandably, and I'll say this a couple times this morning, all of this is with the caveat that you need to be following local and state policies. They trump all of the policies that we have. So institutional guidelines will always be the thing that will be key in place. The NCI trials that are covered under these policies include both the NCORE and the NCTN, which I've just talked about. At the site, there is also work that needs to be done. So multiple things you see here on this slide that really indicate what are some of the institutional policies that need to occur. So there need to be credentialing processes for your APPs at the site to make sure that they can write study orders and it's consistent with, again, the local guidelines and the state policies. There needs to be a statement in your local policy that says a qualified physician investigator will be responsible for trial-related medical decisions, including oversight of the APPs in their capacity, as is probably consistent with a lot of your practice agreements that you have in place already. And then again, the institutional policies need to be available and stored where they are available for review if at any time there is a review that is requested. The sites also need to ensure that the advanced practice providers are qualified to write study orders. And we do have requirements at the NCI where there is a credentialing process that needs to take place. Licensures need to be on file, and lots of different registrations that need to take place. That has to be done and updated on an annual basis. And also we need to make sure that that registration process, whatever the requirements are when there are adjustments, that your site policy is consistent with that. Also, the site clinical investigators need to identify the APPs that are qualified to write study agent orders on the site delegation of tasks logs. So your site policy will include what delegation of tasks you can do. We have a delegation of task log at NCI that also needs to be completed, and these DTLs will indicate what you are able to do. And this is where really, if you're using an investigational new drug and do you have the authority to be prescribing IND agents? So the investigational new drugs are a key component of this, and your site determines really if you're going to be doing that, and then again puts you on what's called the DLT. So there's a non-physician investigator log at NCI that you need to be registered as a non-physician investigator, an NPIVR as we call this, and your clinical investigator must sign off on this task as well. So multiple things that need to happen at your site, as well as credentialing and recording at the NCI level. The CTEP policy for all of this is posted on the Investigators Handbook website. You see the link here, and it's readily available for you. On the NCORE side, we have guidelines instead of a policy, and we updated our guidelines in the fall of 2021 as well. You can see here that we clarified what roles these advanced practice providers could have on our studies, including PhD specific could serve as chairs on studies, and then serving as co-chairs and writing orders and consenting as well. Again, must be actively rostered as a non-physician investigator in the credentialing system and added to the delegation of task logs if that's applicable, and writing orders, just as with the CTEP policy. And our NCORE guidelines are available on the NCORE website in the portal of NCORE, and you can see the link there for the portal. I wanted to close by sharing some data this morning that really shows you how these changes in policy, based on what we heard in that survey, have made changes within our systems. So you can see here from October of 2021 to October of 2022, the number of sites that had approved non-physician investigators for prescribing INDs in the delegation of task logs went from 92 APPs up to 509 this year. The number of protocols with IND prescribing tasks went from 78 protocols to 211. And this last number, I think, is just incredible. The number of individual non-physician investigators approved for IND prescribing tasks went from 380 last year to more than 1,400 this year. So a huge difference in the number of APPs that are involved in the work within the NCTN. Looking at the NCORE side, we looked at enrollments that have taken place, and we went back all the way to 2020. We start our funding year in August, so we went from August of one year to July of the next year. You can see in 2020 with cancer control and cancer care delivery, no activity. And then all the way up to, in this past year, we had almost 800 enrollments that took place for non-physician investigators within NCORE. And within the first 11 weeks, so not even quite done with the first quarter of data for this funding year, we are right on track to stay right at 800 or better as well. At the recent NCORE annual meeting, we held a breakout session focused on utilizing APPs within NCORE studies. We had over 100 people that attended that session, and it was a really robust discussion. And we did ask them to describe how APPs contribute to your research. And you can see some quotes here, and it is very clear that they're critically important to this work. They are enrolling our patients on both cancer control and cancer care delivery studies, and they really pretty much do everything that our MDs do. So I'm really honored to be here this morning and happy to say that we hope that our changes that we have made at NCI have made it more possible for the APPs to be involved in the work, because we've clearly heard how important your role is. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate, for all that great information. My name is Krista Braun-Inglis, and I'm going to do the next piece of this. I'm a nurse practitioner and assistant researcher at the University of Hawaii Cancer Center, and am part of the Hawaii Minority Underserved NCORE. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how do you become an NPIVR. Next slide. Oh, sorry, I thought it was the next slide. Got it. So Kate went over some of this data. I have to say, I'm proud to say that I did do this survey about 3 years ago. And as she mentioned, over 70% of participant surveys were involved, institutions were involved with NCI-sponsored research. But as you can see, only a minority were actually registered as NPIVRs back then, and even less were involved with cooperative groups. So that's why we felt so important to start this initiative, and so supportive so thankful to the Hope Foundation for supporting this initiative within SWOG and our group that's working, our intergroup. So how do you become an NPIVR? First, what is an NPIVR? I know Kate went over that. I'm going to just go over it a little bit more in depth and really talk about it from the APP side of things, as I'm a practicing APP, and then the steps within NCI, and then maybe how that might be a little bit different at your institution, and then what we can do. So what we can do as an NPIVR, as Kate mentioned, we can be sub-investigators on CTEP trials. We can be principal investigators if we meet that NCORE criteria. Right now, it's just as PhDs, but we could serve in leadership roles too at our site, even without a PhD. If we have a master's prepared, or we have a DNP, or we have a doctorate, in a PA level, we can do any of those things. And we can be enrolling investigators on NCORE trials. And what that means is we can actually enroll our patients on trials separate from our physician colleagues. So if there's a nausea and vomiting trial or a neuropathy trial or something like that, and you're really taking the lead on that at your institution, that you can actually enroll your patients separately. So Kate talked a little bit about the RCR. So you might say, I think we speak a lot of these acronyms within the research basis, so I'm just going to bring it down for my colleagues, APP colleagues that maybe are not involved in NCI-sponsored research all the time. So again, the RCR is a repository where the NCI keeps all your information, and really what it's looking at is they want to make sure investigators are qualified to do the research. So you need to go through different criteria or meet different criteria to do the research, and this has to be updated annually in the RCR. So there's 5 different registration types within the RCR. There's a physician investigator, or the IVR. There's a non-physician investigator, who are the APPs, the PharmDs, or other graduate level researchers. There's the associate pluses, which is a lot of our clinical staff, research nurses, coordinators, research associates. They also have entry into CTSU applications as well for data entry. And then there's a couple other, associate and associate basic. So what are the criteria? So you need to fill out a 1572, which is just to say that you're gonna have good conduct on research trials. So we all need to fill that out. You need to fill out a conflict of interest form or financial disclosure form. You have to submit an NCI biosketch, and you have to go through some human subjects training, which is now what NCI is requiring is good clinical practice training through city training. And then you can also submit a CV, that's optional. This is just going down the list. And then you can see how the different categories have different requirements within the RCR. So what does this mean? So I think Kate went over this, but let me just bring this down a little bit more. So for CTEP trials, if you can prescribe cancer therapy at your institution, okay? If you're registered as an NPIVR within the RCR, and if you are on the delegation of task log for that protocol, for the IND prescribing task. So these are all these things that need to happen so you can sign cancer therapy for a patient on an NCI-sponsored trial. If you do not have cancer therapy prescribing, you're not allowed to prescribe cancer therapy at your institution, then you cannot do it on an NCI-sponsored trial either. You can still be an NPIVR, you can still see patients on trials, you just cannot sign. And the other thing I really wanted to point out is many of you have different trial sponsors at your institution. Many big academic sites are about 50-50, 50% industry, 50% NCI sponsored. Those industry sponsors will have different rules and regulations for you. So you just really need to know what you can do based on who your sponsor is. But I am really proud to say the NCI is not holding us back for what we can do, and we've made really great steps forward. When we talk about NCORE trials, as I said, you can serve as a local investigator to consent and enroll your own patients. As far as the NCI is concerned, you can prescribe those orders too. So we used to not be able to write an order for duloxetine on a neuropathy trial, but now we can do that independently as well. And again, we can also take on these larger roles as we discussed. So I want many of you, if you're able, to think about taking on some of those larger roles, being study champions, maybe site PIs, those types of things. And some of our speakers will talk more about that in a few minutes. So I just want to close by really saying, though, your institution may have different policies, and you need to know that. Okay, so you need to check with your regulatory team first. If you're not participating right now as a non-physician investigator and you're interested, please check with your regulatory team first at your institution. Each site can have a really different process, as I've learned throughout my 3 or 4 years of doing this work, is, there's certain sites that, APPs cannot be investigators to enroll patients, right? That, maybe you have to be a faculty member to actually participate to enroll patients. And a lot of us APPs are staff members, so it might be only the physicians can technically enroll patients. And you need to know your state guidelines, regarding what you can do as a nurse practitioner, as a physician assistant, as a pharmacist. What can you do within your state? I know in Hawaii, up to about 2017, we could not actually prescribe IND agents. So that was, wouldn't be within our state, Practice Act. Now we can, and I'm happy to say that we can, if we can, work to our full scope within NCI-sponsored trials now in Hawaii. And I just want to thank you. And if you have questions, we are going to hold questions till later, and you can put them in the chat, because we are monitoring the chat as well for those of you on virtual with us virtually today. Thanks. I am going to stay up here to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Bridget O'Brien. Bridget is the chair of the ECOG Nursing Committee. She is an oncology nurse practitioner at the Robert H. Lurie Comprehensive Cancer Center here at Northwestern in Chicago, and she's an assistant professor and program director at Rush University. And she's going to talk about different types of protocols for APP participation. Thank you, Bridget.
Thanks so much, Krista, and thank you for everybody joining us today. This picture looks a little different than the Hawaii picture, correct? So this is the beautiful city of Chicago, so welcome everybody to Chicago today. We're glad you're here. We hope that you get a chance to actually enjoy it a little bit as well. You have a very busy meeting, I know, but get some time to walk around. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit, because we've talked a lot about how we can really have APPs be involved as non-physician investigators and all the signage, and that may not work at all your institutions, but because of all the hard work that Krista and the whole team have done, we really know that there are many roles for APPs. So even if you have some of those barriers at your own sites, there's a lot of different ways to get involved. This education program hopefully is really going to inspire you to want to increase your interest in clinical trial work, as if you're not already doing it, and your engagement. I'm going to talk specifically on the different types of trials that you could be involved in, and how you could be involved, and what kind of roles APPs can play. I'm going to spend most of my time talking specifically about the treatment-related trials, and then my lovely colleague Marie is going to talk about the more cancer control and cancer care delivery research. So these are the different type of trials, and as you can see, based on the schematic, the reason why APPs are so important, that we want to get them more engaged and continue to be engaged in trial work, is that they really have clinical expertise in this area that they can share with the investigators, with the patients, with everybody across the team. They are able to really look at research evidence, help explain that in a way to patients that often other providers aren't quite as skilled at doing so. We spend a lot of time with our patients. We get to know them really well. We understand their values, their interests. All of our colleagues do this as well, but this is really an area of expertise for APPs, and so they're wonderful partners to really, be very involved in this type of research. There's different types of protocols. There's, of course, the treatment trials that I'll talk a little bit about, and then the cancer control trials, which include symptom management, survivorship, palliative care, prevention, and quality of life, as well as cancer control delivery research. Because I do work specifically with ECOG acronym group predominantly, although we all cross over a little bit, right? I'm going to use the ECOG acronym trials, even though I know I'm here at SWOG. I'm going to use them as an example of how you can really increase participation, or why the APPs are so important as being part of those trials. So just as a sort of an illustrative example, I'm going to walk through a couple of different trials, one starting with our EA 2183. This is a treatment trial. My background has always been GI, so I have to use a GI trial as an example. So this is for esophageal and gastric cancer patients with oligometastatic disease, easy for me to say, testing the addition of radiation. So, it's really a very complicated design, and it really can have practice-related changes. And so when we really think about the scope of these trials and how important they are, when we're really talking about maybe we're going to do something different for these patients, we have to have very good research, very good data, very good evaluation of AEs and all those kind of things. But this is a complicated design to have patients enroll. There's 5 arms for the induction phase. There's 8 arms for consolidation phase. So it takes extensive patient education. And so many barriers sometimes to our trials is that patients are just like, whoa, that seems like too much. Well, if we can really explain it to patients, we can make it in a way that's really understood to them and really talk about the importance of clinical trial work. Sometimes we're able to enroll more patients than we would be otherwise. It really also, as many of our trials, really all of our trials, have significant need for our adverse event reporting. And the APPs are often the patients or the providers that are seeing these patients on a very routine basis. So in my clinical practice, as an example, I'm the one who's seeing the patient often while my physician colleague is, talking all over the world, quite honestly. And so, I'm the one who gets to know really what those adverse events are. And we have to make sure that our APP colleagues are really up to speed with how to record those, how to make dose adjustments, how to follow the protocols. So there are also many of our trials, this one being one of them, requires extensive multidisciplinary coordination. And again, this is really in our wheelhouse. APPs are very used to doing this. Treatment trials often include multiple visits, and the APPs, as I said, are usually performing these visits and making dose adjustments and maximizing symptom management. Additional trials that would benefit from APP's participation, we have a very large trial in ECOG, EAY-131, which is also kind of known as the NCI MATCH trial. This is a treatment and developmental therapeutics trial where we're doing genetic testing for solid tumors, lymphomas, and myeloma. It's a very complicated design with 8 steps. So those 8 steps sometimes become a barrier in our practices. And there are patients that are assigned to one of 38 treatment protocols. So it's really very complicated, but so important. This is really helping us understand all this genetic work that we need to continue to develop. But it needs significant patient education and really that APP expertise. So it's a great opportunity for, even if APPs, as we talked about, if they're not signing orders and not doing all these things that this team has done this great work, they can really be champions for these studies. And I really see that a lot in our clinical practices where they're like, hey, don't forget about the NCI MATCH trial, or don't forget about our treatment trials, and really getting to have the patients participate. We also have another example of EAQ-202, which is improving the AYA self-reported data. This is a cancer control and survivorship trial that has patient-reported outcomes. And again, what we've learned over the years in a lot of our quality of life research, in ECOG-ACRID, we have a huge group of people that do a lot of this work, but we have found at the site level they really need a champion. So somebody really needs to champion that study, kind of take it under their wing and say, hey, I'm going to enroll patients in this study. And so whether I enroll as an APP provider or I at least get them to be engaged in the study, it's really important to forward this research. Still more trials that would benefit from APP participation. We have a smoke-free support trial, which is a CCDR trial. And we know, again, as APPs and as nurses as well, many of us, really spend a lot of our patients talking to them about smoking cessation. I teach NP students as well, and so this is something we tell everybody, that have a conversation about smoking at every single visit. And we teach that to our APPs, and they really become experts in this area. So to have them focus on this as well. In the EAQ-172, this is a treatment and cancer control survivorship. And APPs have really developed an expertise in many years now of dealing with these immune agents and those specific adverse events. So as a treatment trial, we need to have a lot of documentation of the symptom response. And this is an example where it needs, again, that multi-level coordination. They need a bronchoscopy within 4 weeks. And so again, somebody has to sort of shepherd those patients through. And that often is our APP group. So in terms of doing a kind of a deeper dive on the treatment intervention trials, We know that the APPs can function in a lot of different roles. They can be the study chair liaison on treatment trials. So as an example, this was something that I did when I was early on in my career, and I got involved with one of the trials that was a large national trial, and I was the person who really took all those phone calls about, when nurses call in and say, hey, I don't know what to do with this study patient, I was often their first call, and that got me to be very interested and very involved with clinical trial research. So there's kind of a window in. I think the message I'm trying to give you is there's a window in for APPs to be more involved in so many different ways. But the study chair liaison is one way on specifically a treatment trial, because many of us as APP aren't designing the treatment trial ourselves, but we really partner with our physician colleagues to be the experts on managing that trial. We would answer study-related questions, suggest any kind of amendments. It was very common that we were on those calls and continue to be on those calls all the time, that, hey, I'm getting 10 phone calls about this one particular subject, that seems to be a barrier for people, and can we, amend the trial to make it easier? The roles of APPs and cooperative groups is still being defined, so we're going to talk more about this, of how all our cooperative groups are really being challenged to try and increase APP involvement for the reasons we've talked about. We can partner with our PI colleagues and be co-PIs. We can be PIs if we meet the criteria that was discussed earlier. We should be part of the review of concepts of trials. So I'm sure everybody in the room knows that there are trials that, don't move forward or have big barriers or have things. And so if you can get involved, especially as an APP early on, we often are very skilled at sort of the logistics of, what works and what doesn't work for patients, what's never going to be feasible, what are those extra tests that, are required that aren't going to be covered by insurance companies, those kind of things. And APPs are really important partners to add to that discussion. We can be part of the enrolling the patients, of course, assessing for their AEs, and making protocol-based decisions for their clinical care. Because it's very common that we're seeing these patients, ourselves without our physician colleagues. And so we really have to have that educational level to make those decisions. In terms of supporting, if you think about all of you're hearing today and you really want to, add to the increasing the role of APPs in treatment trials, some of the tips that we have is really helpful to have a PI champion at the site. So if your site wants this, like right now we have, at my site, we have 30 plus APPs. I want every single one of them to be part of this process. It used to be I was the lone man standing, and now it really is something that we want everybody involved in. We need support from the whole group. We need physician support. We need cancer leadership support. There needs to be time and energy that's attached to this. So we all live in a world that, it's about, how much money we can generate sometimes for the institution and for how many patients that we can see. But this has to be part of our work, because we really think that clinical trial work is standard of care. And that's how we have to move this forward. We know that if we have active engagements in cooperative groups, that can be really helpful, especially in leadership roles. So when I took on the leadership role of the nursing committee, I actually got some protected time because of that. So there are creative ways that we can talk more about. And then doing some of this cooperative group work actually helps in terms of our credibility with our patients. So when I would say, hey, I'm going to ECOG with the physician I work with, patients know that we're, skilled providers as well and are part of that team. We also, as I said, have this clinical expertise and research expertise, and we want to expand that. As we have more DMPs come out of a lot of the nurse practitioner programs in particular, we have people with this great clinical research expertise that we want to build upon. And we have many universities that have programs that can support that. In terms of APPs and clinical research, I talked already about some of the roles, study chair liaison, working with the PIs. We should have, APP support for this role. We should advocate for clinical research as part of the standard of care, as I said, and then engage with the cooperative groups and build on this expertise of symptom management. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Marie.
Thanks, Bridget. Before I turn it over to Marie, though, I'm going to have to pick up the clicker I just dropped and broke. But I would like to introduce Marie Flannery. She is a nurse practitioner and nurse scientist at the University of Hawaii Cancer Center. She's...
I wish.
Oh, at the University of Hawaii. Thank you. I knew I messed up, and then I thought about it. I wish you would come to Hawaii. Do you want to come to Hawaii? We would love to have you. The University of Rochester Medical Center and School of Nursing, and she's also part of the Geriatric Oncology Research Group and the URC NCORE Research Base. So I would like to welcome Marie.
If we find the clicker.
There it is. Got it.
But it fell apart. Hi, everyone. I'm Marie Flannery. Nice to meet all of you. We're talking about treatment trials and protocols. And everybody who's read a treatment protocol or looked it over, they can range in length. I think the shortest one I ever saw was 30 pages. Lots of them are over 50. Some of them are over 100. So those treatment protocols can really be pretty complicated. I would like to thank everyone for inviting me. For more than, well, let's just call it multiple decades, I was an oncology nurse practitioner. I was at an academic medical center. At the time, we were in the old ECOG. Our site is now part of SWOG. And I took care of patients on clinical trials all the time. And one of the main reasons I wanted to be involved in clinical trials was because I thought that would result in better outcomes for my patients. And if there was a trial going on that I thought would help them live better or live longer, then I wanted to be an advocate for their participation in that trial. And I started working in the outpatient center with cancer patients in the 1980s, and things are very different in the 2020s. So I think that we can thank clinical trials for some, if not a lot, of that progress. So taken directly from the website of the NCI, Cancer Care Delivery Research, thanks for teeing me up, Kate, is a multidisciplinary science that seeks to improve clinical outcomes and patient well-being by intervening on patient, clinician, and organizational factors that influence care delivery. So I'm sure most of you have heard about implementation science. We're talking not just about intervening at the individual patient level, but also at the system level. From cancer control and population sciences, again from the NCO website, the aim is to reduce cancer risk, incidence, death, and enhance quality of life for cancer survivors by supporting innovative research. How many of you, again, I'm going to ask you to wave your hands, know about cluster randomization or practice level randomization? Some, but not as many. So most studies and treatment trials are randomized at the individual patient level. However, particularly in cancer care delivery research, and I have a very simplified cartoon on the screen, what happens is randomization doesn't occur at the patient level, but it occurs at the practice level or the site level. So the circles represent what gets randomized, and then those little squares are all of the patients seen at that particular site or by that particular physician all receive a specific treatment arm. This has implications for study design and may often affect the total number that need to be enrolled on the study, because sometimes it's critical the number of practices that are involved and enrolled. And there are also statistical and analytic implications with this type of a treatment protocol. We've already gone over this a lot. I just want to advocate again that I think that the role of APPs is very attuned to the different systems and contextual issues that may be very important in these types of clinical trials. We're going to talk about roles. I can tell you at the URC NCORE base, I'm going to call out Krista, who is one of the leads on one of our cancer care delivery research studies and really a great advocate for this. So here's a map of the US. You can see where our NCORE is, that little green dot up in northern New York. I also am going to try to tell you a few studies so you understand what protocols look like in treatment trials. And all of these protocols are active and enrolling patients. They are NCORE studies, and their home base is in my network at URCC. So the first study I'm going to talk about as a person who does research in geriatric oncology is a geriatric evaluation and management study. Now, why do I think we should care about enrolling patients in these studies? Well, it asks a very specific question in this protocol. The aim is to find out if a specific care model is going to do a better job, and we're going to combine that with formal survivorship education for our older adults and their caregivers once they've completed adjuvant therapy. So that's going to be compared to usual care. We have actually demonstrated, and most of you are probably familiar with the ASCO clinical guidelines that recommend geriatric assessment for individuals initiating cancer treatment. This care model has been tested in the advanced cancer setting and found to be positive. So now we're moving it into the adjuvant setting. Why should we care about studying in this question and answering it? Well, we know, I think all of us in the room and online know that the majority of individuals diagnosed with, dying from, and surviving cancer are older adults. And with the population trends that they used to call it the graying of the population, but I'll call it the silvering of the population. It's only going to grow in size. And aging-related conditions can make the care of these individuals more complex and different than those of younger age. So older cancer survivors, we know that when they receive chemotherapy, they're going to experience a larger percentage of toxicities than younger adults. And these toxicities persist after they complete treatment into the follow-up phase. So they need a model of care that addresses these needs. They have sometimes experienced complex problems because it affects their functional level and their independence and activities of daily living. And they also have cognitive impairment after chemotherapy. Great trial. Probably all of us would want these patients to do better. This is directly from the protocol, and there are a lot of aims. If you look at the circle, we're looking at the effect of this intervention on multiple outcomes with the primary aim focused on physical and cognitive functioning. And our hypothesis is they'll do better with this model of care. Here's a simplified schema. Remember, this is a site randomization protocol. So your site that you're practicing at will be randomized to one or the other. And then we have a training session for the individuals delivering this model of care. So what happens is every patient has a geriatric assessment, then an individualized tailored plan of care is developed based on what their geriatric assessment showed. And you or the APPs in your setting are seeing their patient at their first follow-up visit after completing adjuvant treatment, and you'll receive a generated list of recommendations. For example, it might say, consider referral to physical therapy for this patient to improve functional outcomes. You determine with the patient and their family members whether or not that's appropriate for them, and then set things in motion. That is part of your routine follow-up visit, but it gives a specific structure to the visit that addresses aging-related needs. They're followed for 6 months and then 12 months on this protocol. There's lots of benefits for APPs being involved in these studies. I'm just going to say the training helps you with all the older patients you see, not just those that enroll on the study. And it's designed to be integrated as a routine part of your clinical care. One thing I'd like to point out in this study is that APPs have been critical in telling us, pragmatically, we looking at your protocol, this is going to work, this ain't going to work. And we're already doing an amendment to try to address these operational issues to make the study more manageable in clinical settings. Next, I'm going to talk about an ENABLE study. Credit to Dr. Marie Bakaitis, who I know is a SWOG member and the leader in your palliative care and end-of-life study. I think this is ENABLE 5. It's an implementation science study that's looking at How do we get what we know is an effective palliative care intervention routinely delivered in our clinical practice? For those of you, you know, we know things from journals and articles and standards of care, but we also know they're not routinely being done. So this study is trying to address that. I think probably all of you know the benefits of early palliative care. I have a long list of studies that have findings that have documented the improvements. ASCO recommends the integration of palliative care for all individuals diagnosed with advanced cancer alongside treatment. But palliative care is not always done and referrals are not always possible. This intervention developed by Dr. Bakaitis stands for Educate, Nurture, Advise Before Life Ends. And it's specifically targeted to newly diagnosed advanced cancer patients and caregivers. It consists of a palliative care assessment and then structured nurse-delivered telehealth, which we're all used to from the last several years, right? Sessions with your patients. These are structured based on the Charting Your Course guidelines. I will tell you an amendment is coming through on this study too, because some of our sites said, whoa, we've had a lot of changes in staffing and availability. We need this to be a more pragmatically available trial. And although this is a nurse-delivered intervention, many of the individuals who are delivering it are oncology nurse practitioners. This study, again, every single patient that enrolls on this study receives the palliative care enable intervention. The difference is the site either receives support for doing that from a technical assistance arm, or the site is randomized to a virtual learning collaborative. So alongside the care that's being provided to patients, we also have scheduled monthly sessions. I think there's 6 of them, is that right? I forget the number. We're looking at it. Krista just said to me, no, it's 6 for the patient. 6. Right. So then we're trying to see which works better. How can you implement change in your practice that's going to be sustainable and help patients? We're moving from a cohort design to a rolling design. But what is unique about this that may look different than other protocols you participate in is when your site decides they want to participate, you actually have an interview, probably not you as the APPs, but your leadership at your site and maybe one of the research coordinators to see if you have everything in place in your setting so you can successfully implement this study. Lots of benefits here again. You're getting education. Every single patient that enrolls on this trial is getting a standard of care, palliative care intervention. We award CNEs, and hopefully we'll find out what's the best way to support your practices when they want to implement practice change. Finally, I'm going to talk about a study. I'm co-investigator on the grants in those 2 studies. This study that I'm going to talk to you about is done by my colleague, Dr. Heyman, and his colleague from Buffalo. And it's URCC 21038. The acronym is DIRECT, and it is addressing disparities in results of immune checkpoint inhibitor treatment. This study design is different. So if you read this protocol, it's 1 arm only, and it is a prospective observational cohort study. So we're enrolling a lot of people and collecting data, and then we're looking for racial differences. Are there differences in the experience between Black and white individuals? The background for this study comes from our limited knowledge of checkpoint inhibitors outside of the clinical trial setting. And we want to know the toxicities, treatment patterns, long-term outcomes, and post-treatment quality of life. I point out this little model because I want you to know how we're following a biopsychosocial model. So we're looking at social determinants in this study, such as healthcare access and discrimination. We're looking at individual and disease-related characteristics, and then treatment-related variables. Not only the experience of immune-related adverse events, but also tracking treatment delay and discontinuation. I'm sure all of you who have been in practice for a while realize how much more frequently you're seeing patients receiving immune checkpoint inhibitors. So I think this will give us valuable information. Here are the aims. We're looking at immune-related adverse events, treatment delay and discontinuation, and short and long-term patient-reported outcomes. I borrowed this slide from my colleague, and sorry for all the transition, but remember at the beginning I asked you if you'd ever read a protocol? There's a very lengthy section on eligibility, and I'm not going to read all of this to you, but what I hope the clinical research associates on the session will realize is it looks very similar to other type of trials with carefully articulating who can enroll and who cannot enroll. Here, again, is the study design, one-arm trial. So we're looking to screen patients, enroll patients. And I forgot to highlight for you on the last slide just how many, 1,800 patients in 50 months. It's a lot of people, right? So we need to enroll a lot of folks, and it has a stratified enrollment. So we have to enroll a minimum of 600 individuals who are Black and receiving this treatment. And I'm looking at the time, and I just show you that we're following all of these patient outcomes with both blood, saliva, and patient-reported outcome variables to try to establish differences. So hopefully this will increase our knowledge base so we know about patient experiences in the real-world setting. And I want to end by thanking you for your interest in involving APPs in clinical trials. Not only do we need to support you, but we need to make sure you feel comfortable advocating for the resources that you need in your setting to be successful in participating in clinical trials. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Marie, for that excellent talk. URCC does so many different trials that support APPs in clinical research, so we really appreciate that. Next, I'd like to introduce Alicia T. DeTroy. She is a physician assistant and the director of advanced practice at Atrium Health Wake Forest Baptist. She's going to talk about overcoming barriers and exploring facilitators of APPs in research. Thank you, Alicia.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today. It has been my honor to work with this team and really see the growth of our APPs in research. Just a little bit about my background. As Krista mentioned, I'm from Atrium Health Wake Forest Baptist. We are in the northwest region of North Carolina and have a 5-hospital system with multiple multi-specialty practices. I have been practicing as an oncology PA with a specialty in neuro-oncology for the past 19 years. But the majority of my time is spent in a leadership role as the regional director of advanced practice. We have 1,000 APPs that I help to lead. That includes our nurse midwives, our CRNAs, our nurse practitioners, and our PAs. Wake Forest is the only North Carolina NCI cancer center, and was mentioned earlier, we are part of the NCORE research space. And I think the reason that I have been involved in research since early in my career is because my collaborating physician is the leader of that research space, and so he has seen the value of inclusion of APPs. So you've heard some about this already today, but certainly we have some barriers to APPs working in research, but I have never shied away from overcoming a barrier. So first, let's talk about those. You've heard about some of the national policies that have caused challenges for APPs in research, but yay, we have successfully overcome with the collaboration with the NCI to some of those barriers. There are likely still barriers that exist, as was mentioned in some of your industry related protocols, so definitely begs the question to explore where those barriers exist and why. We are, unlike our physician colleagues, our regulation as APPs, both in the nursing boards and medical boards across the country. If you've seen one state regulation, you've seen 50. So lots of challenges, and you have to look at your own state practice. And certainly institutional policies. There can be barriers to prescribing. Maybe your state allows you to prescribe, but your institution has a stricter policy. Credentialing and privileging, as was mentioned by our NCI speaker, Kate, you will need to be credentialed and have that privilege to participate in clinical trial research. And then there can be specific policies related to research as well. And if that's not enough, maybe even at the department or practice level, additional policies. Is anyone's head spinning yet? Mine certainly is. So back in 2020, as a good APP leader, anytime there's a barrier, I kind of raise my hand and say, but why? So I started thinking about why can't I sign these study orders? And I'm involved with the PAs in Oncology organization, APAO, and took it to their board and said, can we work with NCI to resolve this? But it opened up a whole lot of other questions. And so we surveyed our membership, because just on the board alone, there was variability in practice. You can see by this slide that from the survey, it was about 12% of our membership that responded, but pretty consistently could order IV chemotherapy and oral chemotherapy, but only about 50% could order clinical trial medications. We actually published this and presented a poster at ASH back in December of 2021. Little did I know that NCI was already ahead of the game and working on this, but it was just ironic that this kind of posed the question for us to investigate. Additionally, from that study, we found that there were individuals who had limitations based on state medical board and nursing board prohibiting. It wasn't as high as one might have thought. And then while my state laws allow me to prescribe, you could see over 50% that still had policies at their institutions that prohibited it. So there are many misperceptions that may be leading to these barriers. Sometimes there is a perception that clinical research requires the physician to be involved in every step. Sometimes I hear that APPs really just want to see patients. They're not interested in research. Or maybe the patient only wants to see their physician and manage their clinical trial care. And then if APPs are not included in research policies, there must be a reason. But I think it's incumbent upon us as APPs and other champions in the room and online that we change the conversation. Clinical research may require physicians in certain elements of the trials, but we really need to start to think about clinical team efficiency. Where is the physician expertise required? Once the patient is enrolled, is it necessary that the physician see the patient for that very first visit? Is that a great use of their time, or could they be using their expertise in another new patient? APPs are interested in research. It's evidenced by today's participation in this symposium. And patients certainly want the expertise of their physicians. We work so well and so collaboratively together, but we know from literature, research, clinical trials that patients want that expertise of physicians helping to decide their treatment course, but throughout the course of clinical trials, they want efficient and effective and safe care. And so we need to think about that from a team-based care model. And what about those policies and where APPs don't exist? Well, we go back to even some of our national policies for PAs and nurse practitioners Many of them were written before our professions even existed, and the same exists in this scenario, where it's probably something that APPs weren't involved in early days in research. But just because that policy exists, let's make sure that we modernize it to current practice. So again, opportunity exists for change. I encourage all of us not to be like I was early in my career. It's very passion provoking, and sometimes you can go into this situation, certainly, with barreling through the forest, not thinking about the trees. I would not recommend that. I would recommend that you really think about it from a patient-centered perspective. What is the best for the patient? I was at the NCORE research meeting in Myrtle Beach last week, and I loved the conversation, really saying that research and clinical trials are the best care for our patients. And so we have to really get into that mindset and see how we can make research opportunities available for all patients. So let's talk about how we increase APP involvement. I think we have to think about where APPs can benefit our research. In all of our clinical training, we really are trained in a holistic approach to care model. So we're not just thinking about the physical health of the patients, we're thinking about emotional and spiritual and sexual health, all of those elements, and really asking important population health questions around what are the social drivers to care and what are those barriers to care. I think that in my personal team-based care model, I have great success in getting those patients to open up and share some of those intimate and delicate vulnerabilities, and it has really improved our care model. And that is so beneficial to not assuming that a patient can't qualify for a clinical trial because of social barriers. Let's think of how we can overcome those. And again, that team-based care mindset, it's not just the physician and the APP, but what about all members of the healthcare team contributing? I think about the role that our clinical research associates play in introducing the concept of the protocols and really helping us to think up broadly. And I think that if we have everyone working towards that goal of getting more patients on, we will be more successful in recruitment. Recruitment is critical. I was excited at the NCORE meeting to see so many APPs, specifically NPs, highlighted as top accruers. So I would love to see that number increase. Delegation of work, as I mentioned earlier, making sure that all members of the team are working to their full scope, thinking about APPs and that population health model. We are high quality care providers. We focus on the population that we serve, and we are lower cost providers. So for a routine study visit, does it make sense to have the higher cost provider seeing that patient? From an economics model, it is effective for the APP to see them. And improved operational efficiency, we've talked about that before this morning, but oftentimes, especially in academic medical centers, our APPs are the constant. They are the ones that are in clinic 5 days a week and really understand the operational flow of patients through the system. So getting them involved in protocol development and helping to make those amendments. So you've got those barriers, you've identified opportunity to change. How do you impact change? When I think about this in my leadership role, I really turn to Cotter's 8-step process for leading change, and I put some time thinking about it from a research perspective. We've identified that patient-centered need for change. Now, how do we facilitate that change? I think identifying sponsors or champions, and I know that we have some non-APPs in the room, and I think this applies to you as well. Having someone who is willing to open those doors that might not otherwise be open to getting APPs more involved. APPs have some research training in their education, but there might be certain areas where they need some additional mentoring. And so seeking those who have expertise to guide them. That could be a long-term mentoring relationship, or maybe just some coaching on certain things like writing protocols or adverse event reporting, whatever that may be. Celebrate the steps towards change as a team, really sit down and debrief, and in those areas that maybe aren't working, aren't meeting your goals, be open to pivoting. And very important, realizing that this is a marathon, not a sprint, so not getting discouraged with additional barriers in the way. And finally, I just wanted to close with, I know that we have talked about the patient-centered need for change and how this can enhance our team-based care. But I also think it's critical that we speak of our APP retention. I just saw some disturbing data from our health system where at 9 to 10 years, we're seeing a dramatic decrease in retention of our APPs. Those are our leaders, those are our clinician experts, our mentors to younger APPs. And so we have to start asking the question, why are they leaving, and what can we do to promote their professional advancement? I think research offers a great opportunity to help fuel their passion and really engage them once they are in that midpoint to more senior part of their career. And finally, I just will leave you, I laughed because we didn't have a formal picture of all the teammates, but this is at my PA colleague's baby shower, and unfortunately, Dr. Lesser was dealing with COVID, so have him separately there. But I encourage you, a final thought, think about your own teams. How are they working to their full scope, and where do those barriers exist? How can you collaborate together to enhance the patient experience?
Thanks so much, Alicia. That was a wonderful talk. We're going to have a panel presentation now. I'd like to call up Marie Haugen from the COG and from the Robert E. Lurie Northwestern Cancer Center, Children's Hospital. She's a pediatric nurse practitioner and the nurse, sorry, Maureen, you're actually the chair of the nursing committee for COG as well.
I actually am not.
Okay, you're the former chair, no?
I was a chair of one of the subcommittees.
Okay, sorry, I lost your intro. And Melissa Faust. Melissa is the CCDR coordinator and manager at the Gibbs Cancer Center for the Upstate Carolina NCORE, and she's going to represent NRG on our panel. And I hope I didn't forget anybody else for the panel discussion. We do have each presenter doing one slide, and then we'll answer different questions that come forward. And I think we can go to, I'm going to do the slides. I'm going to help out with this one. Okay. So I'm going to first introduce back up Bridget. Bridget, do you want to come up? Yeah.
So again, we wanted to talk about how we could, engage everybody in cooperative groups. We're going to talk specifically about maybe our own cooperative group, but this is just really our way to set the tone that we want to have increased involvement. There's an opportunity for clinical research training, both formally and informally. So coming to these meetings, of course, is a great way to engage and learn a lot. Today's a perfect example of that. But in reality, we probably need to continue to augment this. So I know within ECOG Akron, we're really trying to do some educational modules and trying to really have people learn that expertise. A lot of APPs come to the world of oncology without even necessarily oncology experience. So they have to learn all that. And then in addition, really learn all these intricacies of clinical research. There's a lot of opportunity for education. We need to educate everybody on the team, the physicians, the APPs, the practice leadership about the importance of involving clinical research as a standard of care in our roles. Cancer centers need to support this time. Travel support is of course needed. The primary investigators at the center should engage the APPs in cooperative groups. So again, my own example was such that the physician that I worked with really said, hey, you really need to be involved in this cooperative group and involved at high levels so that you can participate as a true team member. And we've really done that with an ECOG-ACRIN. The cooperative groups in general are still trying to negotiate. We haven't always had a big team of APPs at our meetings and at our groups. And so really trying to figure out what that means. How do we engage them more? Is it that we bring them into our nursing committees? Do we create new committees? I think every cooperative group might do this a little differently, and that's okay. But figuring it out and knowing that the APPs are essential providers and that their review of the protocols is really additive. So what we've done with ECOG-ACRIN is that we've had nurses review all of our trials for the treatment trials, the symptom management trials, the CCDR trials, whatever, at a really high level from the very beginning. And we want APPs to be part of that review as well. We also think it's really helpful to have community partners and academic partners because we all have different kind of needs and logistics at our sites. So really thinking about how broadly we can add APPs to these roles. Specifically with ECOG, leadership is extremely supportive of engaging further and increasing the support within the research base. We also are really highlighting this at our meeting coming up next week too, so maybe some of you will be joining us for that too at the Community Cancer Center or the Community Cancer Committee meeting. Many of us are talking again, Krista and I and Kate, really talking about how we again add APPs to the roles and the team. And then we're going to still work through the process how to integrate that specifically through a separate committee or within the previous groups that are already established.
Thanks, Bridget. I'm going to represent Lisa Kutchgady from the Alliance. She is the chair of the nursing committee at the Alliance, and she's actually a nurse practitioner at Mayo and has a lot of experience and a long history with NCI-sponsored research. And she just wanted, she sent in her slide and she wanted to just say Alliance does really encourage APP participation, even to, start to think about developing your own study development, your own research, as she has done that in the past herself. Membership on specific tumor-specific committees. They have an audit team that they think APPs are really great, in audit teams, and wanting to really encourage APPs to think about coming to the group meetings. We know that there's issues with maybe travel support and those types of things and time off from the institution, but really hoping that this workshop today is just getting you thinking about how you may get more involved and what barriers you may need to overcome at your institution as well. So that's where we are with Alliance. Again, we've said that we have this big inner working group right now talking about the barriers and facilitators and how to get APPs more involved. And Lisa's a big part of our group. So I'm going to turn it over to Marie, talk a little bit about URCC.
If you remember back to Kate's first talk, how she had the two NCORE research bases out in the little circle on the side. So I myself represents one of the research base where we're really just doing NCORE clinical trials and developing them. And one of the main things I want you to know is our focus at URCC is on supportive care and cancer care delivery. So we're particularly interested in APP's involvement there because of their expertise and knowledge of the symptoms. And back in June, our research base held for all of our affiliated sites a webinar session on getting APPs involved. And I can tell you our leadership, Dr. Mustian and Dr. Morrow, are really looking for how do we build leadership opportunities that will make APPs feel professionally rewarded by participating in our trials. And if you look at the bottom, I just have a whole bunch of verbs that tell you all the ways that APPs can be involved in our research base.
Thank you, Marie. And I'm going to call back up Alicia, please.
Yes, at NCORE, we are also very focused on symptom management and supportive care trials. And so we talked about it earlier about our holistic approach to care. That is so critical to those areas. I think APPs, for example, can be very instrumental in helping to identify when a patient has a barrier to care. In my world of neuro-oncology, we had patients that were developing significant taste issues, and it was longstanding from their whole brain radiation and from some of the chemotherapy agents. And so we were able to help contribute to design of a study utilizing a supplement like lactoferrin. Another example is I said that we don't shy away from talking about some of the things that maybe other teammates are less likely to ask about, fertility goals, sexual health challenges. And so that has been really important to informing those specific studies. The NCORE research base is really, at Wake Forest, is really focused on health equity. And again, those trusting relationships that APPs develop with their patients can be important. There are historical reasons that patients often mistrust getting involved in research. And so I think if we are able to develop that trusting relationship, we can really help to dispel some of those historical barriers. APPs are involved in routine study visits, as mentioned, delegated visits where they may see the APP, the initial visit, symptom management visits, and supportive care, making sure that we're understanding what the patient's goals of care are. And APPs at a fault, but also a benefit in this situation. We are very astute in our documentation, so it's very helpful for grading adverse events. And finally, as we previously discussed, understanding those operational feasibility and really speaking up for what will work with clinical trials and what we may need to reconsider. And then helping to share the great work that is done, having opportunity for APPs to participate in the writing and the poster creation, as well as presentations like today.
Thanks, Alicia. I'm going to have Maureen come up, and I do want to reintroduce her properly. She's a pediatric NP and the APP manager of the Ann and Robert H. Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago at Northwestern. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It's great to be involved in this project. I'm thrilled that I'm part of this panel here today. As far as how APPs contribute to pediatric clinical trial research, I thought I'd talk about how they're involved at SWOG. And we have a nursing chair, Sue Zupanek. We have 4 nursing subcommittees: education, research, clinical trials, and EBP. I thought I'd highlight a couple of things under these subcommittees that might be of interest. Under our nursing research subcommittee, there's a project going on assessing fertility status, and then a recent nursing research study that was recently funded looking at Spanish validation of personal financial well-being. Under clinical trials, the nursing involvement looks at each disease committee has a disease committee nurse. Under each disease committee, there's also then a core group of nurses who fan out and become protocol nurses. And just like everybody has been talking, it's been super exciting to be part of clinical trials right from the conception, so that you have a say in what may work and what may not work. Under evidence-based practice, we always have an annual call out, and typically topics are set for projects for the year, at which obviously many nurses are love to be involved with. As far as local involvement with COG at Lurie Children's, we have 4 APPs that are currently involved in COG. Myself, I'm part of the overall membership committee. I approve all the members, the nursing membership. And I'm also part of the nursing nominating committee. We also have another APP that is involved in the nursing nominating committee. We have an APP who's actually here today, Barb Lockhart, who's a disease committee nurse on our bone tumor committee. She's also a protocol nurse for AOST 2031, which is an osteosarcoma protocol, and would love adult institution participation as the age limit for this protocol is up to the age of 50 years. And then finally, another APP that is a core nurse on our cancer control subcommittee. And all of these APPs, all of us are frontline providers, so are providing direct patient care, but also heavily involved in COG. One final project that I thought I'd mention that doesn't have, it is not part of COG, is we also have an APP who is a site PI and project manager for an NIH-funded music study for patients with BALL ages 3 to 8 years, which has been great for our hospital to be involved with. I'm sure many of you have staffing challenges, and this is a study that we hope will help prove the need and the worth of music therapists in our population.
Thanks so much, Maureen. I'm next going to call up Melissa. I have to admit, I removed a few of Melissa's slides and we didn't get to talk yesterday, so she's going to do this on the fly. She's had 5 very nice slides.
So first, I'd like to thank Krista and Jamie for involving me in this important project. And I'd also like to thank the Hope Foundation for funding this project. I, unlike, I believe, the rest of my panel, am not an advanced practice provider. I'm an advocate for advanced practice providers participating in research. I come from a community site, and the benefit would be if I can get all of our advanced practice providers rostered, city trained, added to the protocols, would be wonderful, because as everyone knows, a lot of times the physicians don't have the time to take with the coordinators to explain what's going on. And I'll just end it there and I'll go on to my NRG slides. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. All right, Krista. Okay. Oh, well, here we go. So I communicated with the NCORE PI about advanced practice providers, and I couldn't have a more enthusiastic response. She is a huge advocate and supporter, and they want to increase the role of APPs in research. She made the particular comment that cancer care delivery research, which is my area of practice, is about implementing evidence-based practice, and who better, particularly nurse practitioners, who better to implement that evidence-based practice into care. And by the way, I only say that because I'm an RN and I don't know what the PA school is like. So I'm sure that they are very interested in evidence-based practice also. And it would be great to have advanced practice providers act as leaders in these studies and help deliver the interventions, act as site investigators, and particularly enroll and manage the patients who are on the studies. Next slide. Is there another slide? Oh, okay. So let me just give 2 examples of 2 NRG studies that I feel would be particularly well suited for the advanced practice providers. One is a study called Forte, which is NRG CC005. It is a 5 or 10-year randomized trial for patients that have 1 to 2 non-adenomous polyps, and then they're randomized to either a follow-up colonoscopy at 5 years or a follow-up colonoscopy at 10 years. So we could even involve the advanced practice providers in the GI. It's not limited just to oncology, some of our trials. And then the other trial I'd like to emphasize has actually met accrual, but it shows something that I think that advanced practice providers would have been wonderful with. And that was the NRG CC007 CD trial, which sought to increase survivorship care planning from the radiation oncology to the primary care practitioner, to try to continue that care with the primary care physician. So thank you, and a shout out to my staff who's probably watching back in Spartanburg.
I'm going to introduce Jamie Myers. She is my co-collaborator on this project, and I don't know if she formally introduced herself earlier. She is the chair of our nursing research subcommittee, and she is a professor at the University of Kansas School of Nursing. Thanks, Jamie.
Hi again, everybody. I did neglect to say something important when I was doing the announcements this morning because I got nervous. But I wanted to say a public thank you to Dr. Krista Braun-Inglis, who really has been the lead behind this whole initiative. Without whom we wouldn't be here today. And the other thing to celebrate from our nursing research subcommittee within SWOG is we do have representation as a co-chair on palliative and end-of-life care, and that's Dr. Marie Bakaitis. But most recently, we have to celebrate Dr. Virginia Sun, who's stepping into the executive officer role for survivorship and end-of-life and palliative care. So congratulations to Virginia. Okay, so as Krista mentioned, we do have a nursing research subcommittee within SWOG, and I've got our primary goals listed for you here on the left, which same song, second verse, you're hearing it throughout the research basis, where we very much want to collaborate with all the stakeholders within SWOG to make sure that we can provide advice on protocol development. And most recently, we've been providing nurse coordinators to support and/or train site staff where studies are going on that have behavioral interventions, or for ones that have an unfamiliar type of assessment. For example, the neuropathy trial that Dr. Trivedi just recently did, there was quite a bit of training that went along with that. And then we are very interested in continuing to recruit nurse scientists who want to come to the table and either lead or collaborate on symptom control, survivorship, cancer care delivery, and palliative and end-of-life care studies. So thanks to Krista's leadership, though, we have also kind of undertaken this initiative, and I'm so excited that we've had such great collaboration across multiple research bases and cancer centers. So we're very excited about that. So our group meets at each SWOG meeting. We meet twice a year in the spring and in the fall. So if you are so inclined and would like to sit in on our meeting, we'll be meeting at 1 o'clock in Soldiers Field, just a little bit after this meeting. With that, the latest thing to announce related to this initiative is the fact that we also have support from the Hope Foundation to now form an APP task force. And there is a link on the bottom of this slide, which we'll leave up for the break so y'all can have a chance to jot it down. If you're interested in applying, we're taking submissions through the end of December, and the notifications will happen at the end of January. The purpose of this task force is to further define the goals and objectives of APPs within SWOG specifically, and then outline any remaining barriers and propose appropriate solutions to surmount those. This program is, of course, been developed for CME and will be, it is being recorded, and the slides will be available. And so it will be an enduring material for people who want to use it as a resource going forward. But there may be other CME things we want to develop to help disseminate best practices. So what's the ask? We're asking for participation in 2 meetings a year for 3 years, at least one of those being in person. And the eligibility criteria is listed for you here on the slide. So with that, it's time for a break. Yes, Krista.
We did have a few minutes right before the break, but I did just want to just address one question with the panel, because I think while we have these panelists up here, it would be really great. We have a question in the chat asking if they work with a physician that doesn't believe an APP should be involved in research. What is your advice to help break down this barrier. I'm going to call Bridget. Thanks. I think it should be working.
Fortunately, I am not in that position where I've had a very supportive collaborative physician. But I think, information like today and sharing what people are doing at other centers is really important to help break some of those barriers. And so I think we all need to be a network that supports each other in this initiative. There are a lot of physicians that have grown up with nurse practitioners and some of them who have not. And so I think it's really a matter of trying to explain what our scope of practice is and how we can really participate as a team. And so I think really just doing a lot of this education and then looking out for support. So, look out to other colleagues, call any one of us, try and, help have some people, spearhead, assisting you with this. And having those physician groups talk to each other too. So the more education that we can do amongst all providers, not just focused on nurses or focused on APPs, can be helpful as a start.
Thank you. Oh, and Alicia wanted to add, that's great.
I would just add that our physician colleagues often respect their physician colleagues. So sometimes finding a sponsor or a collaborator that may be able to champion what they have experienced working collaboratively with APPs in research can really help be the voice that you need to take those concerns forward. And
Thank you. We are limited on time, but Kate is up here with a question.
I have a quick question for whoever would want to answer it. I think, Alicia, your comment about the data you recently saw, and I think we all know that the workforce is really stressed right now. We're hearing a lot of people leaving the professions. What are the opportunities for recognition within your research bases? And I last week was the Wake Forest meeting, and it was acknowledged there was an award given to the highest accruer for studies was an advanced practice provider. And I think we at NCI, when we do our NCORE awards, could look at this too. But where do you see opportunities there within your research bases for really highlighting the work that we're seeing in this incredible data?
Just quickly, I think involving APPs in the dissemination of the results of studies that they have been integral in, including them in manuscripts and presentations. That's just one idea. I'll let everybody speak.
I would add partnering with your APP leaders at your institution. We have recognition weeks, and we often recognize for different areas of excellence, and we do recognize for research excellence. So I think beyond the research space, how can we recognize in our health systems as well?
Yeah, I would just add to that, again, specifically in ECOG Akron, APPs have not been really highlighted in terms of, their involvement. So my example that I used as a study chair liaison, that was not something that really people knew all the work that I was doing behind the scenes. So I think bringing this kind of attention is part of it as a first step. And then developing really more defined, whether it's a committee structure or a subcommittee or a task force, specifically for APPs, and getting this sort of engagement and education out is, again, a starting point. But I love the idea of, there being some awarding of, whether it's enrolling, whether it's engagement, whether it's years of service, those kind of things, because there are a lot of APPs that have been part of research bases for a long time, and I think they're kind of unsung heroes. So I appreciate the question.
Maureen, did you want to add it down there? And then Melissa?
I guess I'll just add a couple of things that I've done. And one of them really started with the start of the pandemic, in that we all weren't interacting with each other much at all, especially early on in the pandemic. And I started something called a Good News Report. And basically it's a monthly email that highlights any good news, but I also do highlight any publications, presentations, posters, abstracts that were submitted, just so that we get out what people are doing. The APPs that I in our division, we have a little over 40, in oncology at Lurie Children's. And I would say about a third of them are fairly senior. And so we have a lot to offer the junior people, and it's really good for them to see what we're doing. And then the other thing that I started this year is something called a giving goal, where an APP gives back to, I might have limited myself, but I restricted it to giving back to another APP within HEMONC. And so I've encouraged people to be creative, and many of them have done things just as we're talking about, is mentoring in speaking, in participating in COG, and being creative with trying to professionally develop these APPs.
Thanks, and we'll finish with Melissa.
I just wanted to piggyback onto what Kate said about recognizing specifically about CCDR, because I so appreciate, and I was just in awe of that nurse practitioner at Wake Forest who enrolled, I think, 80-something patients. She received an award from Wake Forest, but I don't think she'll get an NCI award, versus if she'd enrolled 80 treatment or even 80 cancer control, she would be at the platinum level. And not just for APPs, but also for our physician investigators. I would love to have something come from the NCI that recognizes the efforts, because sometimes the efforts on investigators for CCDR studies and for APP investigators is actually more than the effort, for example, a cancer control study, because of the multi-level structure of a CCDR study.
Totally agree, Melissa, and appreciate those comments, and I really appreciate the panel's comments and discussion and presentations. We are going to take a 10-minute break, a 10 to 15-minute break. Let's make it 10, so we try to keep on schedule. There were a couple other questions that came into the chat that I will try to address through the chat to keep us on task. So I haven't forgotten about you, but yeah, let's take a break and we'll meet back at 10 to 11 Chicago time.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully not everyone's still stuck in the restroom. So we're going to resume, and the next part on the agenda is to talk about the down and dirty details for protocol implementation. And I'm really excited that we have a wonderful triad of speakers getting ready to give us these details. And they're all from UC Davis Health Comprehensive Cancer Center. We have Dr. Nicole Mahaffey, who is the Assistant Director of Protocol Review and Monitoring System. We have Joyce Nancaro-Tull, who is the Executive Director of the Office of Clinical Research, and Dr. Joyce Lee, who is the Senior Clinical Pharmacist for Investigational Drug Services. So we're very excited for their presentation, and they've given us some wonderful slides that will be a lasting reference point. So whoever's first up.
Good morning, everyone. I have, like all researchers, a few disclaimer statements that I need to make. And if you've ever been to a research presentation, we always do this. First of all, I am not an advanced practice provider. I have a great deal of respect for all of you, and I'm grateful for every single one of you. I am a nurse of 45 years, the last 17 of which have been spent in research. And so my pathway turned, and I have loved every minute of it. I want to tell you that this is kind of our maiden voyage for this slide set. We are doing the very same thing at Davis and really fully integrating our APPs in the research roles. I have been there 11 months, and I have depended on APPs at Ohio State, at Yale University, at City of Hope, and at University of Southern California as right hands for us in research. So I want to say we are very grateful to have that happen at Davis. The slide deck is substantially dense, and I want to apologize in advance for that. It's because We are about to talk to you about the nuts and bolts of getting this done. And it's great to talk about what you wish to accomplish, but it's really, the devil is in the details, as they say. And we want to make sure that we arm you with some tips, some tricks, some key points that you need to cover, as well as some of the perils and pitfalls that you can encounter. And so there may be a lot of questions. There may be things that you wish to clarify. At the end of the slide, we have all included our email addresses so that you're welcome to reach out to us. All right. Let me make sure I had a couple of other things. I want to call your attention to one other thing and leave you with a homework assignment when you leave today. I want you to go back to the NCCN guidelines, nccn.org. You're all providers, I'm sure you've all registered. And when you get to the PDFs that outline the guidelines, I'd like you to look in the upper right-hand corner of those guidelines. There is a lovely little statement. It says, the NCCN believes that the best management for any patient with cancer is in a clinical trial. Okay, so let's get started. So, oops, let's go in the wrong direction. Let's go in the right direction. This is Nicole's slide, and Nicole and I work very closely together, and you will find that our entire presentation is based on one key thing, that we extrapolate out from your work, your notes, your clinic notes, your consult notes, your daily work, the data that tells us the answers for the database and that ultimately drives the research conclusions. Your work is called source documents, or SOURCE to be short, and it tells us everything that we need to know, or conversely, it doesn't tell us what we need to know, and we have to come find you. Okay, today we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of consent, eligibility. We're going to review some adverse event assessment, grading tools, dosing and modifications, and we're going to talk a little bit about disease response assessment and RECIST 1.1. As many of you know, particularly those of you involved in hematology, there are a variety of assessment tools and standard metrics used to assess disease response. We're going to touch on one of them today, and I'm going to clearly say that there will not be enough time to cover everything. So we are asking one other homework assignment from all of you. If you find needs that you would like to see in future presentations, please let Jamie, Krista, or any of us as panelists know what we could have done better or included that will help you in the future. So let's talk a little bit about consent, and I am not going to read through all the slides, which is why I've asked them to be posted on the website in addition to the recording so that you can go back and refer to these. But I think everyone who has stumbled through, slogged through city training or any aspect of basic research training through the NIH understands that there are some key points that you have to achieve. Certainly that there are basic principles of consent, that there are standards for those working in research, that it can be, informed consent can be delegated by the principal investigator to a variety of people. And in my first place of work in Michigan, in a community location, I was consenting patients on a regular basis. But there are key component pieces of that. And so it's very important to understand that you must follow those privacy and confidentiality rules. You must give them voluntary consent, and you must underscore the fact that at all times they have the right to withdraw consent. This slide goes over very basically the key points about approved consent, what it is required to do. So when you're confronted, and we were laughing about it in the first section when we were listening, we have one protocol that has 2 sections. Each section is 678 pages. And so these, to cover all that information for our participant and to fully inform them of their rights and our obligations to them while under the trial, it does often take something like a 30-page consent to do so. Please know that in research circles, there are main efforts that are working to try and limit, curtail, any word that truncates the extent of consent while still covering all the rights. But these are the main rights that we all promise when we do research that we will protect and promote for our participants. In many states, there is a research subject bill of rights, all right? And in many model consent forms, which is the consent form that we get from the sponsor of the trial, be that industry, cooperative research base, or an investigator-initiated trial designed at your own institution, these are the key pieces that need to be covered. And when you write a consent note, and we ask that you do write a consent note that indicates that you've consented a patient, we ask you to cover these key pieces, that they had enough time, there was no pressure, they could stop at any time, they understand what the study is trying to find out and what you'll be asked to do as a participant in the study, that they have been told the reasonably foreseeable risks and the possible benefits, any costs associated with the research, how to get a hold of anyone if they have questions at any point in time, the other non-research treatment choices, there are alternatives, and treatment for a research-related injury. All right. All of these are covered in the model consent form, and you can refer to them. I have also known people to use Cerner or Epic Smart Phrases and to just template this so that they could drop it in very easily to a note. Your role is to document, okay? And I know that sounds truncated and very simple, but it is priceless to us. There are research-specific tasks and orders, which we'll ask you to do, and there's a very small representation on this slide of a page that is in almost every protocol that I've ever seen, and it is a study calendar, and it tells us exactly what needs to happen. However, there is, as with all things, there is always an asterisk at the bottom of this, and it says that sometimes there are other things buried elsewhere in the protocol, and that is why research coordinators and clinical research folks help you through this. But there is no replacement for reading through a protocol adequately, all right? We ask that you follow institutional guidance on HIPAA documentation. It varies widely. In some places it's attached to the consent, in some places it is held as a separate document, but we do need that done. And we always ensure that the participant receives a copy of the consent, any assent, and the HIPAA privacy rule. Please note that for us, consent is an ongoing process. It's not a one and done, all right? It is something that changes as the study changes. And we always promise our participants that as they know, we know more about the study, and as more information evolves, we will let them know. That's our promise to them. So there may be reconsents, and we all love reconsents because sometimes there are just a few too many of them. We do have an obligation to get them that information as quickly as possible. And in the initial inception of notification, it can be as simple as, hi, I've been notified that there's going to be a little bit of a change in the dosing schedule. We're going to have that in print very shortly. We'll be happy to let you know about that as soon as we do. It's not going to affect you because you've already completed that portion of your treatment. And the simple documentation of having said that is often the beginning of assuming correct reconsent. I stress this over and over again. All of your documentation becomes source for us. And if we are to put anything in our databases, then we actually have to have it in source that we can show it to an external reviewer. Could be a sponsor monitor, it could be an auditor from one of the research bases, it could be the FDA. Eligibility. I think you, in one of the previous presentations, saw a little bit of eligibility, and there's a short outtake from a SWOG protocol here. You'll find that it has a lot of detail, and it is, having been at 5 universities and a 6th where I was educated, I will tell you that it varies widely how people address this in their notes. But it is important for us to have source documents for every single one of these and be able to prove. So the places that we tend to get stuck sometimes in source documentation are life expectancy, performance status, and very often menopausal status. So we ask you to pay special attention to those sections, and I believe I'll be covering that in the next slide. Please note too that NCTN trials do not offer eligibility waivers. Okay, I say that very black and white, very clearly. There is not that opportunity. There are, with some industry trials, opportunities for eligibility waivers and other mechanisms where eligibility can be tweaked a little bit by the medical monitor, but that is not the case with NCTN research. Okay, if someone decides to go ahead and enroll that patient, and it will be deemed ineligible on audit, and we will hear about it. Okay, so we try really hard to avoid that. Another key point is that there are many tests that are done in the course of assessing and monitoring routine safety events, but research-related events, in other words, events that are required specifically for the research study that would not ordinarily be done under this banner of standard of care, those must be performed after consent to be eligible to be used as part of the eligibility and the source documents. Okay, so we ask you to keep in mind that very important caveat. There's some other pitfalls on this slide. Washout periods we have to pay attention to. We also have to pay attention to specific days or the half-life of medications. Complete histories and physicals are incredibly important if so directed by the protocol calendar. Very rarely do I see an abbreviated H&P at this point in time. Cardiac health assessments are another place, so make sure that you're familiar with the standard for that particular protocol. It's always specified in the protocol, and generally it's clearly outlined in the protocol also. So, serious adverse events are a very interesting topic that we'll cover in a later slide, but if we, they particularly are often related to eligibility pieces that we skipped over or we didn't look at as closely as we should have. All of us have struggled at certain points in time enrolling a patient to a trial and saying to ourselves, gosh, I wish they fit, I wish they fit, I think they'll fit, I'm going to try and make them fit. And they don't fit no matter what. And so I want to tell you, one of the common sense rules I've learned over 45 years of nursing is if it does not happen in a fairly measured way, there might be a really good reason that there isn't. Very often, I have watched those patients fail eligibility, and then within 24 to 48 hours, there's a status change that would have made them ineligible for the trial. So pay attention to that funny little thing that keeps happening and make sure that you complete all the assessments appropriately. That helps us on the research side. And it's important to understand that while I can try very hard to understand a clinician's viewpoint and certainly have some experience with that, I am now a researcher and I look at this from a data-driven standpoint. Okay. Con-meds are another place, or concomitant meds are another place that we find their gaps, and we also find their kind of hidden landmines. We'll discover that a patient was taking a drug and we had no idea, and that drug is prohibited on the trial. So we make sure that we see a very clear list beforehand and that we're clear when they've stopped medication, and that's very clearly noted in the documentation. Please note that a signature on an eligibility checklist, which you may be perfectly allowed to do in terms of state practice acts and in terms of the cooperative groups, is not sufficient. We ask that you review everything on that eligibility checklist. You're a double check for us. Now, I can tell you in most institutions I've worked, we've instituted our own double check process. It is generally a senior person that looks at it the second time to make sure it's a fresh set of eyes, but you're another one. And when you sign off, you're telling us that you agree with us, that we've done everything correctly and we're good to go. The last known treatment day must be clearly documented. I think I ended 6 months ago is not quite going to be good enough. Okay, so we need to understand that. And sometimes we have to go forth as a research team and track down those records and clarify with other providers from other places. This is particularly true at academic medical centers where we end up getting referrals from all over the place, and we try to provide an advanced level of care on an earlier phase trial. And also you'll find sometimes there are sponsor-specific forms, particularly in industry trials, that must be completed, and those forms are just as important and require your input and professional expertise. To clarify some things, IP is not always intellectual property for us. It's investigational product. It is the agent used in the conduct of the trial, all right? So that's how we refer to that. It is how an FDA inspector, having been through 8 or 9 or 10 FDA inspections, will also refer to it. Please give special attention to prohibited medications. They always are written in the protocol. If we do not see them as we set up for the protocol, we do go forth and ask about them. There is always in our site a site initiation visit, or SIV, that is conducted prior to the trial, and that helps us answer those questions that we may or may not see in the protocol itself. Again, you can see my comment about performance status. Blended numbers like an ECOG 1-2 is not acceptable. It's either a 1 or a 2. And for those of you who have been a part of this before, I've looked at a documentation that is an ECOG 1 when you're in a hospital bed in an ICU, and I just need to clarify that's not compatible. Protocol-specific tools are very important to understand. We use those. We generally have those printed out and may at times ask you to sign them, okay, just to check our work. And your research team is here to support you in helping us as a team get a patient on a trial. It's important to understand, and I, there's this harkens back to someone else's quote, but it does take a village to do this. It takes a village to get them on, it takes a village to find them, it takes a village to keep them on the trial, and it also takes a village to support them, okay? But that's, to me, that was one of the most important things as I came into research, understanding that that was my role, especially as a nurse. Also understand that we are human people doing human subject research on humans by humans, so there is this little possibility of human error, right? So things aren't always perfect, and we try very hard to tie it up with a bow and make it as neat and tidy as we can, but sometimes it just doesn't quite work out, and that's okay. All right. My colleague, Nicole Mahaffey, has been just a tremendous addition to my life. As I came to UC Davis 11 months ago, Nicole, at that point in time, was responsible for all of our data coordinators. And much of what you're looking at in these slides was a product of Nicole and I talking with her data coordinators, who are our end product placement people, right? They put it in the database, and that's how we all get paid, and we keep this endeavor moving forward. She was one of the people that helped me see that this was a really important aspect that we needed to make sure that we came back to you as the practical aspect of what we do. Nicole also helped me get oriented to UC Davis in Northern California, which, by the way, is a gorgeous place. And you're 5 minutes from the farmland, you're an hour from the coast, so if you want to come visit anytime, you're welcome to. Nicole is my local research expert, and she's going to speak to you about this, but we've already agreed, again, these are relatively truncated slides, and so if you have questions, again, our contact information is at the end, and we're happy to answer additional questions. Nicole, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Hi, team. I want to thank everyone for my invite to speak to you today. I'm very excited to be here. My experience in working with PAs and NPs has been nothing but positive, so I'm very excited to help support this effort. But that being said, I find that when training my team, disease response is actually the most complicated thing that they need to understand. The reason for this is not that the source is all that complicated, but the fact that the actual scans and the actual bone marrows are complicated. And oftentimes, if any of you have been to tumor boards, clinicians don't agree, even in practice, what is going on with the patient. Is this patient responding? Is this even a tumor, or is it all necrotic tissue? There's a lot of disagreement, and unfortunately, we can come together and we can make these decisions when we are in a clinical practice and move forward. But for research, it needs to be more standardized. Most therapeutic trials have endpoints against response in some manner or another, whether it be response rate, progression-free survival, disease control rate, all of these things depend on defined responses. And also defining a response allows us to not directly but indirectly compare trials that have different treatments that may not have been pitted directly against each other, but are running off of the same response. So unfortunately, again, not all cancer looks the same. We're all very familiar with the fact that cancer is actually hundreds of different types of diseases all lumped together under one sum. None of them look the same, none of them respond the same. So there are multitudes and multitudes of different responses, some of which are listed here, but this only touches the tip. And I will tell you that my training on each individual response is about an hour long for my team. So I really did try to focus here on just the common errors that we see that my team identified, that kind of throws a hiccup into getting that data in and getting the patient's response identified appropriately. And I think one of the biggest mistakes and disservices we can do to our patients is to either keep them on a trial when they are in fact progressing, or take them off a trial when they didn't progress and might have had a response or disease control. So it is critical that we understand the responses for each protocol and can document them appropriately. That being said, we're going to focus on RECIST 1.1 today. This is a solid tumor response, so we're not even touching the blood tumors. And again, high level. So the first thing that RECIST 1.1 standardized was kind of laying out the rule that how you assess a tumor at the beginning of a trial needs to be how you assess it throughout the trial. So even though RECIST allows for chest x-rays, what it doesn't allow for is to have a baseline CT scan and then a chest x-ray. So it laid down the foundation to say how you assess a patient in the beginning, you need to assess that patient the same way all the way through the trial. Some of these things we take for granted now, but they weren't always rules, and we had a hard time comparing those results across the trial. I also wanted to point out here, obviously, that research always grows. So our responses always grow, our drugs always grow and change. I thought about only putting 1.1 on this slide, but I did just want to point out that RECIST 1.0 exists. Depending on your institution and your practice, you may be called upon to interpret an old scan, deal with an old query. Please just recognize that 1.0 had very different rules than 1.1, so this is just a call out that it does exist. So the second thing that RECIST standardized is how you pick the lesions that you are going to identify to follow for response. And this is vastly different from our clinical practice, what we see, at least what I have seen with my investigators in a purely clinical setting where they look at the entirety of the scan and what is going on as a whole. Here we select specific lesions and we identify them early at the beginning and say, these are the ones we're going to follow. These are the official lesions we are following for response. The verbiage surrounding this is target lesions and non-target lesions. The important thing to know here is target lesions are followed by measurements. They're followed discreetly, and they have rules. So not everything can be a target lesion. A non-target lesion can be anything. So this, as long as it is cancer, so I will qualify that. And you follow them by very simple criteria of absent and present. So you do not measure these. Target lesions, we measure discreetly. And the reason why we do this is it allows us to categorize patients who are, quote, responding. If you're only looking at a lesion and you're only looking absent versus present, you're missing a whole slew of patients who are having that partial response. So following target lesions allows us to do this. But like I said, there are very specific rules about whether or not a lesion can be a target lesion. Bone lytic lesions are not allowed. Those have to be non-target lesions. Tumors, so non-lymph node malignant tumors. Most at least in the practice that I have seen, most of the time we are getting CT scans. At UC Davis, we only order spiral CT scans, so a lot of protocols are specifying the need for spiral, but the long axis of the tumor needs to at least be 10 millimeters in order for it to qualify to be a target lesion. For lymph nodes, it's a little more strict, and this is a huge pitfall that we see because tumors are allowed to be 10 millimeters, but a lymph node needs to be 15 in short diameter. This was such a problem that we have hard-coded our source documents so that when a coordinator selects that the body system is a lymph node, it physically won't allow them to type anything lower than 15. It turns red and it screams error, and there's a whole bunch of red flags. So pay attention here. This one is a huge, huge pitfall that it has to be that. We recommend, or not recommend, everybody has different practice, but we have started requesting bidimensional measurements on all of our scans simply to ensure that we're following the correct direction, long versus short. So again, these are the pitfalls that we see with regards to setting up your baseline log. A lot of times, be it, people get busy, the FDA is here, or COVID and we don't have enough staff, and then people wait to set up their logs. And while this not necessarily can't be done, it is asked that you set your baseline log before you have a response log. We never want to be thought of to be looking at the scans and picking out target lesions that we see are responding and putting those ones on the log. So also, it often plays into eligibility. You often have to confirm that your patient has a target lesion that is evaluable for response, because a lot of protocols do want to capture this partial response realm, which you only can get if you have a target lesion identified. It is recommended that you avoid previously radiated lesions. I also recommend to my team that we avoid lesions that in the future might be radiated. A lot of protocols allow for prophylactic treatment of lesions that are causing pain. If your patient has a painful bone lesion, and you think that in the future you might need to prophylactically radiate that, but you are following it for response, as soon as you radiate it, you can't. And then your overall response becomes not evaluable and you lose that data set. So you do have to look at the picture of your patient when selecting these target lesions, but you also have to work closely with your radiologist, if at all possible. Avoid lesions that are close to the organ wall. For the lack of the better word, when they grow, they get smushed, and then your tumor can change size, and all of a sudden you don't have a long diameter, and you want to avoid your radiologist coming back to you and saying, I can no longer measure this lesion, because then again, your patient is not evaluable. None of us have a crystal ball, and RESIS does have a whole subset of rules that handles merging lesions and splitting lesions, but it is a documenting nightmare. So we recommend that you avoid picking lesions that are close to each other or in danger of splitting, just because it really is hard to measure that moving forward, and it will be a huge amount of effort. You saw on the previous slide that there was, I can go back really quickly, there was documentation that your target lesion should be distributed over all affected organs, evenly distributed. And this is a clever way of them saying that your target and non-target lesions, your full picture of your RESIS that you have picked, should be a quick glance of the total disease that your patient has. So we have seen some investigators say, this is a lung cancer patient. I'm following 2 target lesions in the lung. Well, that's great, except for the fact that they have metastasis to the liver, they have a couple lymph nodes, and all body systems that are affected should be represented either as a target lesion or a non-target lesion at quick glance on your disease assessment. And again, going back to Joyce's notes in her presentation as well, Everything comes down to source. This can be accomplished in a multitude of different ways. You can work with your radiologist. Some people put it in office visit notes. Some people have CRFs that they're filling out at every assessment. But however you do it, it should be clearly documented. The next huge pitfall area that we see is in calculating that target lesion response, because it's math and none of us want to believe our high school teachers when they say you will be using algebra in the future. And it's not simple, even though, our sponsors love to pretend it is. So of course you think a complete response, that's gonna be easy, everything's just disappeared. So it's important to highlight that RECIST has the caveat that for lymph nodes, anything smaller than 1 is considered a pathological response. And this is because lymph nodes have a job in the body. They don't just disappear. When they are performing their normal functions, they show up on CT scans. So this is a conversation that your coordinators will be coming to you with, or you can bring up to other investigators, and they will say, the radiologist is still saying this is cancer, but they're measuring it as 8 millimeters. And this is a discussion that needs to happen. We have this discussion 3 or 4 times a year. It's just lingers, it never goes away, it's always there. So you have to make a medical decision on whether that is cancer or not. And per RECIST, if it is still cancer, it gets recorded at least as 1, so that it is not considered resolved. And I'm not gonna lie, this is always an issue. I just got queried on this for an alliance trial that the patients were enrolled 20 years ago. So they were doing a data sweep and it happens, and I walked up to the investigator with a tumor log and he was like, what? So it comes back to haunt you. Responses, your complete response, your partial response, your stable disease, everything that goes into a disease control rate, these are all calculated off of your baseline. So everything that is considered a response runs off of your baseline total. So these 30% decreases, a 20% decrease, all of these decreases you are seeing are calculated against your baseline total. Your progressive disease, that's calculated off of your nadir. So it's important to note the terminology of nadir, which is the smallest measurement over all of your assessments of your patient. We often see patients progress where their total sum of disease is still lower than what they had at baseline. But it is important to note that if your patient has a nadir of 1 and all of a sudden their tumors have shot up to 3 centimeters, even though at baseline they may have had 6, that's still progressing, the treatment's no longer working, and we pull them off trial and they move forward. It's also important to note that for not evaluable disease, if you don't have all pieces of your evaluation, it's not evaluable. So if you were only able to run a CT chest and then your patient got dizzy and they collapsed and they went to the ER and they were unable to get their CT abdomen, and you didn't have the measurements of your liver disease, that response is considered not evaluable because you didn't have all of your data. Okay, and this is just a visual picture of what I was explaining before. It's important to note also for progression, and this changed between 1 and 1.1, that you not only need a 20% increase in your lesions, but you also need a 5 millimeter total increase in your lesions to count for progression. And this is to avoid those minute tumor swings if you only have 1 target lesion and it grew from 1 to 1.2, which is recognized in the field. It could just be a different radiologist measuring your tumor that time. This is to prevent pulling patients off for progression on small incremental increases. But you do need both. So if you see here under RECIST 1.1, even though the patient had a 57% increase or a 30% increase from nadir, it's not progression because it was only 0.3 centimeters total. And again, I know I'm going through this quickly. Like I said, this is normally over an hour with my team, so please find me if there are any questions. The last slide is just kind of avoiding more pitfalls. I went over target lesion response because that is where we see the most errors. Obviously, you have non-target lesions to deal with, you have new lesions to deal with, all of this. I'm more than happy to answer questions about, but you combine all of these for an overall response. And it is that overall response that gets recorded. My clinicians love to write in their notes that the patient has mixed response, which is fabulous, except for that's not actually a thing in research. So if they want to say that clinically, that is fine, but they also need to identify a research response. If any part of your response is not evaluable, you cannot have a response. You cannot have a CR, a PR, or a stable disease at that time point. You can progress, but you cannot have a response. And the other important part for you as, emerging research, basically investigators, is you have the right to do what is good by your patient, right? If your patient is progressing and we just happen to pick target lesions that are somehow stable, you can pull them off of the trial. You can pull them off for clinical progression. This will be recorded officially for the trial as physician discretion, but, and the official research response will read stable, but that is always within the rights for you to do what is right for your patient. And with that, I'm going to hand you back over to Joyce to talk about the fun world of adverse events.
Thanks so much, Nicole. I think you highlighted a topic that's incredibly important. There is physician or investigator discretion. So as sub-investigators on a protocol, you have a right to make decisions that are in your patient's, and you have the responsibility to make decisions in your patient's best interest. That is not always remaining on the research protocol. And we have to make those in some manner in partnership, because your research personnel will be happy to clarify if it is going to be allowed, if it is not going to be allowed. And then you have ultimate responsibility along with your principal investigator of the study to make the decisions that will best affect your patient. So please don't ever forget that. We are very specific in protocols. We're very precise. That's not the way life always works, right? We know that as practitioners, and so it's really important to make sure that you remember that when you have a patient on a trial. To go to dose modifications and adverse events, all protocols should have some version of a toxicity grading to standardize. I have noticed that in some of the investigator-initiated studies that we sometimes see, particularly from departments outside of hematology oncology, we sometimes see some unusual grading systems. We try really hard to get those folks to standardize because there is benefit to that. There's comparative analysis against that, and there is a structured body of data that is really helpful to us. So when you do not see that, please reach out to us and clarify. We're probably doing exactly the same thing in the background. Adverse events may be expected toxicities, and I go over this because one of the first nurses that I ever oriented after I had gotten oriented, we went through the list of symptoms, and I said, so tell me what you saw, and she listed all of her symptoms except one, and it was peripheral neuropathy. And I said, you didn't list peripheral neuropathy, did you not hear the patient? And she said, oh yeah, I heard her, but that's expected with platinum therapy. Okay, we have to remember that we see this from a clinician hat, but we have to see it from a researcher hat, all right? And the researcher records in almost a dispassionate way every single piece of data. And then you get to be a nurse, and then you get to solve it, okay? Because I know you will, and I know you'll make it better. But I also know that as a researcher, I have to have that piece of data very clear. The other thing I've discovered, particularly in interviewing patients, is that often, and this is certainly not anything, any form of judgment, but I've discovered that we have a way of talking with our patients, and we have a way of making them comfortable. And I like to believe that it's because we're advanced practice providers, and it's how we've been raised, if you will, in the profession. And as a result of that, they often tell us things that somehow when they get to the doctor, they just sort of forget. And I particularly saw that when we were doing the ibrutinib trials at Ohio State. In fact, we saw it to the extent that they were so concerned that they had progressed that they would very nicely empty their pills into their shirt pocket and say, oh, I don't have any pills left when they came in, because they were so afraid of being taken off treatment. That's the bugaboo in the room. Right? That's the one that doesn't want to get addressed. And so we really have to dig a little bit sometimes. We have to ask them, really, can you feel the brake pedal? Can you button your buttons on your coat? We have to dig a little deeper. So I want to remind you as an advanced practice provider to make sure that your assessment is complete. We depend on that. And when you get to the dose modifications, and for that matter, the reasons to take a patient off trial or end a particular drug that's part of the regime, we really have to represent the patient and make sure they're safe. Please know that that is the number one thing we promise. And then if an FDA inspector ever happens to grace your life, they are interested in two things. Number one, the safety of the patient, and number two, the integrity of the data. Okay? Those are their issues right there. So again, make sure you're using the right tool of assessment. There are substantial changes from version to version in CTCAE. The one I remember that was so cataclysmic turned into a major discussion on the subject of assessing hypertension. And in one version, it's considered not a grade 1, and the next version, it's considered a grade 1. Okay, so it fell in line with changes that were being done by the American Heart Association. But if you weren't a clinician and you weren't paying attention to that, it was easy to miss. All right, so pay attention to your version. Many of us have EMRs that have this embedded in the EMR. That's tremendously helpful. For those of you who live off of your iPhone, smartphones have these apps. They are readily available. You don't have to carry the thick little booklet around with you anymore, or necessarily be anyplace else. These are all very portable these days. And all protocols should have a section on dose modifications and adverse event assessment. In that same section is the information about significant or serious adverse events. Okay. At the bottom of this page is a link to CTEP, and a lot of the information cross-referencing the different versions is there. So it helps you crosswalk between version to version. Please pay special attention, and this is an outtake from a SWOG protocol where it talks about dose modifications, and for that matter, an inability to modify dosing. There are points of no return in trials. All right, there are also re-escalation parameters very often, and paying attention to those is tremendously important. When in doubt, please ask questions, because we like to be real precise about this, and we want to make sure that we follow the rules. You'll hear people who work in research refer to it, the protocol, as their Bible, and particularly when you're dealing with a non-clinician research personnel, you will find that they are relatively rigid about that. Okay? The gray areas don't exist. Again, investigator discretion is a topic that we rely on. It doesn't mean that you can change the protocol dosing rules or the protocol. It just means that you have an obligation to a safety judgment as to whether or not the subject can tolerate whatever is the topic, dose, drug, procedure, event, etc. If you decide not, please, we ask you to very specifically document, because very often those are the documents that we depend on as we're extrapolating out information into the database, and the auditors look specifically at those notes. I don't think that it's surprised that we pull our adverse event assessment and grading, and then subsequently attribution to that grading from your notes. And things like fatigue resolving aren't quite as exact as I'd like them to be, okay? It's 1s or 2s, but not 1-2s. A rash on a leg needs to have another descriptor about percent of body surface covered, type of rash, etc. And if we don't understand, you will be our new best friend. We will come and find you, and we will ask you very specific and sort of nagging questions, okay? And it's because we have to make it fit in a tiny little box on some EDC or electronic data capture database, all right? So, and they are built with little tolerance, so. AEs are assessed and graded and attributed at each visit, but at minimum follow the study calendar. So I always function under the rule that if you see the patient, we need to be doing this. All right. There are situations, especially on the hematology side, that people would prefer not to do this because sometimes we just want to get you to the next step of the next cycle. But that's something that you can talk with the principal investigator about. Again, please avoid unclear descriptors. They must be reviewed by an investigator to ensure correct classification. So in my first role, I was very comfortable grading and assessing, but attributions, the causality of why it's happening, is done by someone with more knowledge and more experience than I have. And that's true of most clinical research coordinators. All right, we're looking for you to say, is this related to the drug therapy or any drug that's being used? All right, that's incredibly important because in some cases, further reporting depends on that information. I warn all of us, EMRs are both our greatest joy and our greatest craziness. We are all familiar with copy paste errors. I don't think I'm talking about something that this room is not familiar with, right? But be careful what you copy and then you paste, because we encounter them all the time and they're fairly obvious. So I just that's enough said about that. While you understand, and likely I understand, we bring on and train a variety of people in research every year. As the pandemic and the Great Resignation taught us, like all professions, we suffered exactly the same thing, and sometimes to a very worse extent than every other profession encountered, which was a massive attrition of staff and a massive problem of how to train people who somehow never envisioned research as their career. And I didn't either. If somebody had said to me when I was working in hospice, or when I was, in NICU, or when I was in any number of the places that I worked early in my career, oh, you're going to be a research person, I would have said, no, that's unlikely. But now it is my life. And I want you to understand that a lot of the people we bring into research, they never envisioned themselves working in research. So we train them. We have foundational courses at UC Davis. We have a class that links us to a local community college and creates careers for people. We establish a float pool so that we can always have our next best research coordinator in training. We have all sorts of tools that we're using right now to make sure that we don't run slim on the people that help to back you up as you're caring for your research subjects. But we encountered some pretty significant staffing challenges, just like everyone else, and we've had to retrain. So the point is, just understand that they may come from a biology background, a genetics background, a microbiology background, a chemistry background. If they show interest, we will work with them with a certain set of credentials and a certain level of understanding. And most research universities, research programs have probationary periods, just like everyone else does. And very often, these are people who are set forth on a new career path and find themselves absolutely loving it, but they may not have the background that you have. All right, so remember that in the things that you do. Also, anything that the subject reports to anyone, by anyone, has to be documented, graded, and attributed. And the NCI Guidance for Investigators is at this link. It is also the NCI Investigator Manual. I encourage and actually suggest to all the people that I train, you must read this. And by the way, just keep a copy sitting on your desktop. When you're looking at AEs, I ask that you step back for just a minute and beware of the overall impression as well as the overall picture. So I can sit and I can grade fever grade 2, chills grade 1, vomiting grade 2, malaise. I can do all of that, but if I put the pieces together and the patient walks in and looks like they have an influenza-like symptom or an influenza-like disorder, you can also grade it as a general disorder, flu-like symptoms grade 2. Okay, so be familiar with the CTCAE version that you're working with and the fact that there are some overriding syndromes that you can use. They may fit, they may not, that's up to your clinical judgment. Please help us by promptly responding to us. And I would be a fool if I represented that we don't ask a lot of questions. We do. We also double check a lot of things, and at times it may seem like we're a bit naggy. Okay, I'm going to apologize in advance for every research person across the spectrum, but I'm also going to remind you that this is data that drives the end conclusion of the study. And at the end of all of this, long after you're done seeing the patient and you've sent them off into survivorship and they are doing beautifully, we're still processing that data, answering queries, ensuring that SWOG has everything that they need so that they can tie it up with a nice little bow, and Phyllis and all the people at Stat Center can do their work, and we're done, and we've got a good conclusion on our hands and a great publication that hopefully names you as a great accruer, right? So all those things go on for a very long time. We store records. We no longer at our site even bother. We just store the records. We have records that go back quite a ways, all right? And so the point is, if you help us by answering the queries that we give you, we get that off of our list and we move the data and the study conclusions ahead faster. All right, we're not doing it just for fun and games. We're doing it because we want to make sure that we get to the conclusion. And also remember this, if you're involved in research, you're here to answer questions. It goes with the territory. We truly believe that we'd rather have you ask than have you guess. And so if you've got a question, everyone all the way, I've called study chairs, they're awesome. They make time for you. There is no such thing as a silly question, all right? And the big thing to remember is we like to avoid deviations. We feel so much better when we don't have those. You know, they're sort of like being bitten by a lot of mosquitoes. You just don't like it. It doesn't feel good. So we like to avoid those deviations, and you can be instrumental in helping us with that. Let's talk a little bit about serious adverse events. All protocols should have a section on SAE reporting. It is your study team's responsibility to understand that clearly. We really just ask one thing out of you that's pretty simple. Tell us. That's it. If you remembered everything, tell us as fast as you can. Right? Send us an email. Your study site will likely have a reporting system in place. I know we do, and you're looking at one of the people who gets that, rain or shine, evening, morning, weekends, holidays, whatever it happens to be, she gets the reporting. And for us, it's been very easy to have that as a one-stop shop, but as an investigator joining a protocol, you need to be aware of what's your SAE reporting mechanism and make sure you understand that your obligation is to get us information as fast as possible. Please know that. We don't have to have a complete picture all tied up nice and pretty. We just need to know that something has happened. We have actually waited a very long time to get records from another state or to get a complete SAE report. We shepherd it along, we keep an eye on it, we move it along as best as possible, but our main obligation is to do what's called open the ticket or get the report in. For the reporting system, there are assessments made along the way at various parts to how important is it? Is this something that should be shared with many people? How many people does it potentially affect? But if we never tell them, that can't possibly happen. So in every protocol, there is guidance about where it needs to be reported and how frequently, what the timeline is. Please be familiar with that. You don't know? Ask your coordinator. They should be able to give you that information readily. And it is very important to us. But again, the report has to be started, and you are helpful to us in that tremendously. So thank you. As more information becomes available, as we get the records from Pennsylvania, as we find out more information because the patient either declines or improves, we will add additional information to the SAE and to the ticket, and the research staff amends it, right? You should know of high incidence of sponsor queries that focus on the medical etiology. So they look at the information very clearly and very closely to make sure it's incredibly precise, it's been classified and made as discrete and unique as possible, all right? So that it can be placed in a database and a conclusion can be drawn as a part of the greater whole. We'll be following up with you. The review and the deviations are not a delegated responsibility. So we will let people know. We also let them know on review and for the regulatory aspect of this There are immediate reports to the IRB that is overseeing the trial. There are also ongoing reports as a part of the annual review. So there's lots of different ways that we report this up through many different channels. There are differences in classification, grade, and attribution. They are subject to some final determination by the local PI of the trial. That is the person who signs off on the annual review that's submitted by the regulatory group. And so it's really important to understand that since they ultimately sign the 1572, they are the people that make the final determination on the data. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Joyce Lee, who is also from Davis, and will talk to us a little bit more about this.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. First, I want to thank Jamie and Krista for inviting me, and also the Pharmaceutical Science Committee to participate in this wonderful workshop. And so for the next 5-10 minutes or so, I want to go over some of the dose modification guidance in the protocol, and as well as I want to highlight the SWOG dosing policy. So as Joyce mentioned earlier, each protocol should have sections that specify the dose modification guidance. In all the SWOG protocols, section 8 is the sections that outline all this information. And in these sections, the AE grading scale should be specified, especially the version number. Most commonly used is the NCI's CTCAE scale. However, some of the other disease states might use other grading scale to assess toxicity. Other important considerations or guidance listed in this section usually is about missed doses. So it's important to know for each protocol, if the patient missed a dose, especially for oral drugs, what the patient do. Should they take the dose, or what kind of time frame, within what time frame they can still take the dose, or should they skip the dose? Dose re-escalation is also should be specified in that section. So most protocol, once the dose is reduced, most of the times that the re-escalation is not allowed. However, there are some protocols will allow the re-escalation. So it's important to know the rule. Maximum dose delay and reductions is also important. So how many days the patient can delay the dose, or what is the maximum number of dose levels that the dose can be reduced. Particularly important in this section, of course, is the detailed guidance for dose modifications in terms of toxicity or other reasons. So now we want to go over what is the reason that we want to dose reduce a drug or treatment. In oncology, as we know, most of the drugs come with a lot of toxicity. So the most common reason for dose modifications are toxicity. So this can be assessed based on laboratory results or symptoms or diseases. Usually these are categorized by either hematologic toxicity or non-hematologic toxicity. The other reason, the main reason for dose modifications is drug-drug interactions, especially for some of the newer agents or oral agents. A lot of them has interaction with the enzyme inhibitors or inducers, so which will require significant dose modifications. Some of the example including ibrutinib, venetoclax, or osimertinib. All these drugs are require empiric dose modification if the patient is on any strong CYP inhibitors or inducer. So for SWOG, we have a dosing policies or a research calculator for clinical trial policy number 38. So I will just go over a little bit about this, highlight some of the key points about this policy. So the purpose of this policy is to promote consistency among all the investigational sites. The current version is just modified or updated last year. And some of the key tools or highlight guidelines, including ideal body weight, BSA calculator, and the creatinine clearance calculator. So within this policy, it outlines some of the dosing for initial dosing and also for patients that has ongoing treatment. In oncology, most of the drugs are dosed based on body surface area, or some of the drugs are dosed based on the body weight. And usually protocol will specify body weight, what type of body weight to use, whether it's actual weight or ideal body weight. And sometimes they also specify what weight is it? Is it baseline weight, screening weight, or current weight? And there's a dose rounding rules. You can round dose within 5%, and this is could be due to the drug package size or the dose formulation. And it's important to know that BSA calculation is always based on actual body weight. So for patients that is significant obese or overweight, which at least 2 times the ideal body weight, we recommended the determining the patient's eligibility or the enrollment of the treatment should be individualized. So the provider, the treating provider should really evaluate whether this is the best patient's best interest to be in this clinical trial using the protocol-specific dosing. And I list here the ideal body weight calculations. The male is 50 kilo and female is 45.5 plus 2.3 times the inches over 60 inches, which is 5 feet. So the problem or issue with this calculation, you can see here, what about the patient is shorter, like under 5 feet? What do? Do we subtract from the 50 kilo or 45 kilo? So that's become controversial. So for those patient populations, the estimation using this formula is actually inconsistent. So in 2005, there's a clinical pharmacokinetic models being developed to calculate fat-free mass. And this model incorporates patients' gender, height, body weight to predict the fat-free mass. So instead of using ideal body weight, we will take in the combination of this predicted fat-free mass and body mass index. So to evaluate whether the patient is within the normal weight category or is obese or underweight to consideration and calculate the ideal body weight. And SWOG has actually a really good tools in the website, which I will go over more detail in the next few slides. So when the patient is on treatment, again, we know that there are a lot of toxicity involved and that might require dose modifications. So again, the criteria should be listed in each protocol. And again, in SWOG protocol is in section 8.0. And it's important to weight the patient prior to each cycle of the treatment. And if the patient's weight change more than 10%, it could be either weight gain or weight loss, the dose should be recalculated unless the protocol specify that you stay with the regular, baseline weight or some other particular weight. But that's the general rule, is to recalculate the dose if the patient has significant weight change. So now I want to touch on the creatinine clearance. Cockcroft and Gott is the most commonly used estimation of creatinine clearance. Although this is just an estimation, we know that GFR should be the most accurate way to estimate renal function is to measure 24-hour urine collection. However, that is not always feasible and it's really difficult to achieve. So most protocol or most of the time commonly used formula is Cockcroft and Gott equation, which is outlined here, which take into consideration the patient's age, weight, the gender, and serum creatinine. However, this formula tend to overestimate the renal function. So in order to sort of compensate that down pitfall, there are different ways we implement and recommend to when we use this creatinine clearance as a dose for drug dosing, such as carboplatin dosing, we have these recommendations or in this policy to cap the weight to 1.4 times ideal body weight, so that we would not use patient's actual weight if the patient is obese or more than 40% of the ideal weight. And for patients that have low body mass, such elderly patient might have very low body mass, then they may generate or excrete less serum creatinine. So we want to make the serum creatinine to a minimum 0.7 instead of using the actual. And the overall creatinine clearance, we will cap it at 125 for dosing. And this is, sorry, and if your site has some particular EPIC or EMR system setting that allow to set this limit, that will be really helpful. And I want to share with you is like the SWOG has actually a lot of tools for calculations in the SWOG website, which I listed here. They have creatinine clearance calculator as well as ideal body weight and body surface area calculator. So this is when you go to SWOG website, that's where it is, and you go to the clinical trial, and then there's a CRA workbench. And you can type in your CTAP credential to access to the tools, and all those calculators are there. And I really highly recommend you to look into this calculator and to use this as the guidance. And because this calculator, some of them, especially the creatinine clearance and ideal body weight, actually take into account the variables that I mentioned earlier about the patient under 5 feet or the patient's obese. Those adjustments is actually built into those calculators. So I highly recommend you to explore and using this calculator for dose calculation. And with that, I will conclude my presentation and we'll take some questions.
Thanks so much, Joyce, and Nicole. I mean, we put a huge ask of you guys to do that in 60 minutes, so that was really awesome. We are running out of time. Are there any questions from the audience? I think we've been fielding questions in the chat. I think the next slide gives your guys' contact information, so I'm just going to put that up for the participants as well, you know, in case they want to contact you guys directly, because I think that, you know, the information there is so crucial. And what I really wanted to point out too is that the research staff, you know, like you guys are it's so important for us as APPs to have that resource. And I really think for us too, to be a resource for you guys, it goes bi-directional, and if we can work together more, it's all just to the improvement of the conduct of the trial. So thank you so much, because it's so important, because I mean, we see patients every day, but we don't think about all these specifics, and I think it's so important for us to get educated on this. So thank you. We also had a poster, I mean, our last, I think, slide here is about the APP task force, and as my mentor and physician champion, Dr. Jeffrey Berenberg, pointed out to me, that he said, what if there's others like physicians or other nurses or coordinators that might want to be involved in this task force? Please go ahead and apply. This is a work in progress, you know, so that's a great thought. We want to be inclusive, not exclusive. So yes, please go ahead and apply, and we'll take a look at all applications if you're interested. I also wanted to say that our group does have a poster at JADPro Live to talk about the work we've been doing that's coming here. And JADPro Live is the annual meeting for advanced practitioners in hematology oncology. And just that initiative, this whole initiative is really about education, integration, and promoting leadership among APPs. So I really want to thank everybody for coming today, and just give a shout out to everybody at Hawaii Minority Underserved NCORE as well. Thank you.